Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you close your eyes, I have a little favor to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin. The night was thick with fog, the kind that crept in and swallowed everything whole. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd seen the stars, or the moon for that matter. All he knew was that the chill in the air gnawed at him, creeping under his jacket and making him wish he'd dressed warmer before leaving the office. The city streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of distant traffic that seemed to come from a world away. It was the kind of day where the air smelled like rain, thick and heavy with the promise of a storm. The kind of day where a man could disappear into the small, forgotten shops tucked away in the crumbling corners of a town. Adam had found one of those shops on his walk through a part of town he usually ignored, a cramped little antique store that smelled like dust and mothballs. The kind of place that most people would cross the street to avoid, but not Adam. No, he was curious about things that other people would turn their backs on, things that had histories, strange histories, histories that didn't quite make sense. The sign outside the shop read simply, Curiosities and Oddities. The letters were peeling, the wood warped and weathered by time. As Adam pushed open the door, a small bell above it jingled, its sound hollow, unsettling. Inside, the air felt thick with something ancient. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the shelves were cluttered with strange trinkets and curios. Old books, rusted keys, a jar full of what looked like broken porcelain fingers. But it was the doll that caught his eye. It sat on a small, dusty shelf in the back corner of the shop, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead, its porcelain face painted with a smile that was too wide, too perfect. Adam wasn't sure what drew him to it. Maybe it was the way it seemed to call to him, a silent beckoning that pulled at his very soul. The doll was old, undoubtedly, its frayed dress and cracked skin a testament to its years. But there was something undeniably compelling about it. The shopkeeper, a thin, hunched man with wispy grey hair and a stooped back, watched Adam's gaze. "It's a rare one," he said, his voice rasping, as if the words had been stuck in his throat for years. "Found it in an estate sale not long ago. Real antique." Adam approached the shelf, his fingers brushing over the edge of the doll's cold, smooth porcelain. It felt wrong, as if the doll's surface was too perfect, too unyielding. Yet it was undeniably beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten. The eyes were dark, almost too dark, like they were pools of ink that didn't reflect light. The smile, it was too wide, too knowing. "Why is it so cheap?" Adam asked, trying to push past the unease that crept up his spine. The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Some things are better left alone, son. You're sure you want it?" "It's not for everyone." Adam chuckled, though his skin prickled at the man's words. "Yeah, I'm sure. I like old things. They have stories." The shopkeeper didn't say anything more, just stared at him with those tired, knowing eyes. Adam didn't let the strange atmosphere deter him. He reached out, lifted the doll from its perch, and felt a chill run through him as the cold porcelain touched his hands. The shopkeeper's voice followed him as he made his way to the counter. "It's not the doll you need to worry about, it's the eyes." Adam smiled at the old man's cryptic remark. "I'll take it anyway." He paid, thanked the man, and left the shop with the doll tucked under his arm. As he stepped out into the street, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. But something felt different now. The street, which had once felt familiar, now seemed strangely empty. The houses that lined the block looked crooked, their windows dark, like they were all watching him. The air felt thick, the kind of thick you only felt right before a storm broke, and Adam found himself walking faster, gripping the doll tighter against his chest. His apartment was a small, cozy one-bedroom just a few blocks away. As soon as he stepped through the door, he set the doll on the small coffee table in front of his couch, eyeing it with a mix of fascination and unease. He had to admit, the doll was striking. It didn't matter that its smile was too wide or that its eyes seemed a little too dark. It was a piece of history, an artifact, something with a past, something that had lived a life before he came into the picture. Adam made himself a cup of coffee and sat on the couch, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort that seemed to hang in the air. He told himself it was nothing more than a silly feeling, nothing more than the overactive imagination of someone who had watched too many horror movies. But as he sipped his coffee, his gaze kept drifting back to the doll. At first, nothing happened. The world outside remained dark, the storm finally breaking, rain pelting against his window. Adam finished his coffee, flicked off the lamp beside him, and settled in for a quiet night. And then it began. A soft, scraping noise, faint but undeniable, came from the direction of the table. Adam froze, his heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was nothing, just the old wood groaning beneath the weight of the world. But then the sound came again. A soft, insistent scrape, like a fingernail against porcelain. Adam sat up, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head toward the coffee table. The doll was still there, sitting innocently in the same position, its eyes staring straight ahead, its smile fixed. But Adam could have sworn, just for a split second, that the smile had grown just a little wider. He shook his head. Number. He was imagining things. He'd just had a long day, that's all. He stood up and walked over to the table, his eyes scanning the doll one last time before he picked it up and moved it to a different spot on the table. He turned off the light, telling himself that he was being foolish, that it was just a trick of the mind, nothing more. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, every time the darkness pressed against him, he could still hear that soft scraping noise, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Every time he glanced toward the table, the doll seemed to shift ever so slightly, its eyes always watching, its smile always there. Adam didn't sleep, not that night or the next. Adam tried to dismiss it at first, the scraping noise, the strange feeling that there was something in the room with him, something watching from the shadows. He told himself it was nothing. The doll was just that, an old, harmless piece of porcelain. Maybe it was the stress from work or the anxiety of the approaching storm that rattled his nerves. Maybe it was all in his head. But that didn't explain why. When he woke up the next morning, the doll was no longer on the coffee table. He remembered placing it there the night before, right where it had been since he bought it. But now, when he sat up in bed and rubbed his eyes, the doll was gone. His pulse quickened, a creeping panic unfurling in his chest. Adam threw the covers aside, his feet hitting the cold wooden floor. His breath came faster as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Where is it? His eyes landed on the armchair by the window. There, sitting with an unnerving stillness, was the doll. It was perched on the edge of the chair, facing him, its glassy eyes wide and unblinking. The smile on its face had grown, slightly, just enough for Adam to feel a knot tighten in his stomach. He walked over slowly, his footsteps hesitant, almost afraid to get too close. The doll didn't move, of course. It was just a doll. But the longer Adam looked at it, the more unsettled he became. Its eyes didn't just stare at him. They seemed to follow his movements, tracking him with an unnatural precision. And the smile, it was wrong. It was wider than before, far too wide. It's just a trick of the light, he told himself. But even as he said the words, they didn't feel true. He bent down, picked up the doll by its frail body, and turned it over in his hands. Its porcelain skin was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer overnight. Adam shivered, but he didn't know why. He placed the doll back on the coffee table, deliberately turning it so it faced the wall. That should be enough. Out of sight, out of mind. Right. The next few days were a blur. Adam tried to go about his life as usual, but there was a constant sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching him, even when he was alone in the apartment. He'd leave the doll in one place, only to return and find it somewhere else entirely. The first time it happened, he thought he was losing his mind. He'd placed the doll on the shelf by the window before heading out to work, but when he came home that evening, it was sitting in the center of the living room floor, just staring at him. He'd tried to ignore it. He really had. But after the fifth time, after finding it in the bathroom, staring up at him from the sink, he couldn't pretend anymore. He wasn't losing his mind. The doll was moving on its own. The air in the apartment had changed too. The room felt colder than it should be, and Adam could never seem to get the temperature just right. The lights flickered randomly, their dim glow casting eerie shadows against the walls. Sometimes, late at night, he could hear something faint, like the sound of the doll's porcelain limbs scraping against the floor. It wasn't just the doll anymore, it was everything around it. The world felt out of sync, as if some invisible force was bending reality around him. Sometimes, when he walked past the coffee table, he'd feel a cold breath on the back of his neck, as if something was standing just behind him. And though he'd never turned fast enough to catch it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's smile was wrong. Too wide. Adam's mind was racing. He needed to get rid of it. He'd been foolish to buy it. Whatever strange energy had clung to that porcelain figure, whatever dark force had made its home in the doll, had started to infect his life in ways he couldn't even understand. That evening, he grabbed the doll and shoved it into the nearest bag, determined to take it outside and burn it. He wasn't going to risk waiting for whatever malevolent force was inhabiting it to take full control. As soon as he stepped out into the cool night air, the first chill of autumn biting at his skin, he felt a sense of resolve wash over him. This was it. No more strange happenings. No more flickering lights or cold drafts. The doll had to go. Adam walked quickly to the alley behind his building, the doll slung over his shoulder. He wasn't sure why, but something about the darkened alleyway seemed fitting for what he had to do. The further he walked, the more the streetlights flickered, dimming as if the night itself was watching him, urging him to turn back. But he didn't. He reached the trash cans at the back of the alley, grabbed the nearest matchbook from his jacket pocket, and struck a match. He was about to throw the doll into the flames to watch it burn to ash, when a voice, low, soft, almost a whisper, breathed out of the darkness. "Don't!" Adam froze. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. There was something in the way the voice carried, something ancient in its command, that rooted him to the spot. The air around him seemed to grow even colder, the fog thickening, swirling around his feet. His fingers tightened around the match, the flame flickering in the growing wind. He heard a soft rustling behind him. It was a sound too close, too real. But when he finally forced himself to look, the alley was empty. The doll was still in his hands. He looked down at it and then, in horror, he saw that the smile on its face had changed. It was no longer simply too wide. It was twisted. Porcelain lips curled into something darker, something far more sinister. And then he noticed the eyes. The doll's eyes, once glossy and empty, were now wide open. It was as if the porcelain had been cracked, revealing the black voids beneath. The eyes were staring at him, watching him with an intensity that no lifeless object should have. The smile grew, stretching impossibly wide. Before Adam could act, before he could throw the doll into the fire, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The shadows in the alley twisted, and he felt something unseen, grip him by the throat. His heart raced as the air grew thick with an oppressive presence. The doll began to laugh. It was a soft, raspy laugh, low and guttural, like it came from somewhere deep inside the earth. The laugh echoed around him, bouncing off the alley walls, reverberating in his chest, until the sound was all-consuming. And then, before Adam could scream, before he could even think, everything went black. When Adam woke, it was as though he hadn't slept at all. His mind was hazy, groggy from whatever dream or nightmare had plagued him. But it wasn't just the foggy sense of consciousness that unsettled him. It was the cold, the unbearable chill that had seeped into his very bones. The air felt damp, heavy, like the moments before a storm broke. He rubbed his eyes, his head pounding, but when he looked around, he realized something had changed. He was back in his apartment, the same old coffee table, the same worn armchair by the window, the same crack in the ceiling that had always bothered him, the one he meant to patch up one day, but never got around to. Everything was as it had been, except for one thing: the doll. It was sitting on the coffee table once again, its glassy eyes staring directly at him. Adam's pulse quickened, his chest constricted, a panic rising in his throat as he jumped to his feet, eyes scanning the room in a frantic frenzy. He had been certain he'd left it in the alley. He had seen it in his hands as the shadows had twisted around him, laughing, pulling him into something dark and suffocating. He had felt it, the cold grip on his throat, the sharp pull into darkness. He had almost died, hadn't he? But now, the doll was back, sitting perfectly still in the same place where it had first appeared. His head spun as he stumbled towards it. There was a lingering taste in his mouth, metallic and foul, like something rotten had seeped into his very soul. He reached out, hands trembling, and gripped the doll by the shoulders. It felt colder than before, like it had been frozen. His skin prickled as he lifted it, noticing how impossibly heavy it had become, the porcelain-like stone under his fingers. He glanced at the window, no movement outside. The sun had barely risen, painting the room in a sickly light. A low, distant rumble of thunder could be heard, but it felt muted, as if the world outside had gone deaf to the suffering inside the apartment. With shaky hands, Adam turned the doll over. Its eyes, those eyes, were open again, staring with an intensity that sent a shiver straight down his spine. The smile had grown wider, the cracks in the porcelain surface deepening, stretching across its face like fissures in a broken dam. The scrape of the doll's limbs shifting, ever so faint, came next. "Stop it," he told himself. "Just stop. It's not real." He turned it back to face the table, but the doll's smile remained, twisted and stretched, just barely within his peripheral vision. And that's when he heard the whisper. A voice, so soft it was almost a breath, but undeniably there. Adam froze. "Let me go." The words weren't his own thoughts. They didn't come from inside his head. They came from the doll. It was an eerie, raspy voice, like the sound of something clawing at a rotted, wet wooden door. Adam couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mouth went dry as the words echoed in the room, settling in the air like a thick fog. "Let me go." The hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention, but his body wouldn't respond. He could feel the weight of the doll, its unblinking eyes watching him as though it were waiting for something he couldn't name. He slowly set it back down on the coffee table, this time with the intent of keeping it there. His mind screamed at him to throw it out the window, to burn it, to rid himself of whatever curse had attached itself to that thing. But something deep inside, some primal instinct, kept him from acting. The room seemed to throb with a low hum, and the silence between the occasional thunderclap felt more suffocating than peaceful. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just the voice. Adam felt it, a pressure on his chest, as if the doll were not just watching him, but reaching for him. The hairs on his arms stood at attention as his stomach churned violently. The room seemed to close in around him, as if the walls were pressing forward, and the air had thickened into something tangible, a viscous substance he could feel sticking to his skin, to his thoughts. "Don't!" The voice wasn't just in his head anymore. It was real, solid. It was coming from the doll, a low, melodic whisper. No, something he couldn't escape. A promise, an invitation, a curse. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table as he turned to flee. But before he could reach the door, he felt something cold and heavy on his wrist. It was a hand, small, delicate, impossibly cold, gripping him with a strength that no porcelain doll should possess. The doll's smile was wide, too wide, and the eyes were alive. Adam could see it now, the faintest flicker of movement in them, like someone was watching him through the blackness of its pupils. Something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. He jerked his arm away, but the grip on his wrist tightened, squeezing like a vice, and he could hear the faintest sound of the doll's laughter. A horrible, hollow sound that felt like it was coming from the very walls of the apartment. Adam tried to pull free, but it was no use. The doll was laughing, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the porcelain cracking under the force of its grin. It should have been impossible, but it wasn't. He could feel the doll's presence growing, thickening, filling the room, pressing in on him from all sides. The temperature dropped again, colder than before, until the air around him felt like ice, seeping deep into his skin. The doll's eyes never left him. "Let me go," it whispered again. Only now Adam realized it wasn't just a request, it was a command. The walls trembled, the lights flickered violently. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted into grotesque shapes, figures with eyes too wide, bodies too thin, all staring at him as if they were waiting. Watching. Adam ran. He didn't care where, he didn't care what would happen next. But as he bolted toward the door, he could hear the doll's voice. So faint it was almost lost in the storm outside. "I'll never leave." And that was when he knew. The doll would always be there. Always watching. Always waiting. Adam ran, his heart hammering in his chest, like a drumbeat that quickened with every step. His breath came in short, jagged gasps as he reached the door of his apartment. But when he grabbed the handle, it didn't budge. It didn't give. He yanked harder. Nothing. The door was locked, but it had never been locked before. He could feel it behind him. The doll's presence, the whispering in the room, still clinging to him like the residue of a nightmare that refuses to fade. Adam turned slowly, his legs unsteady, dread pooling in his stomach like a cold, stagnant pond. His gaze darted across the dimly lit room. The doll was still on the coffee table, the grotesque smile stretching wider. Too wide. The eyes, those black holes, seemed to follow him. Adam could almost hear the soft scraping sound again, as if the doll was shifting, its porcelain limbs moving with the slightest of jerks. The laughter came again, faint but chilling, reverberating in the air like a dull thud. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on him, and his pulse quickened. He could feel the air thickening, growing heavier with every breath. It was wrong. Everything felt wrong. The world outside had become a distant memory, fading like a dream that slips away just before you wake up. All that was left was the cold, the oppressive silence, and the unblinking eyes of the doll. It's impossible. It's just a doll, Adam thought desperately. But the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The doll's smile had become a cruel parody of something human, its face contorted in a way that felt almost alive, too alive. It was like it was mocking him, taunting him, whispering that it would never leave, that it would always be there. "Let me out," he rasped, the words tumbling from his lips in a broken, frantic plea. But the room didn't answer. The shadows only seemed to grow darker, their fingers curling, reaching, clawing at the edges of his vision. Adam backed away from the coffee table, his feet dragging, his eyes never leaving the doll. He wasn't sure when the apartment had stopped feeling like his own. It was like it had become part of the doll's world, a world where things were twisted and unnatural, where every corner seemed to hide something sinister. And then, just as he was about to turn and try the door again, the doll moved. It was so sudden, so wrong, that Adam couldn't process it at first. One moment, the doll was perched there, staring at him, and the next, it had shifted. Its body had twisted slightly, its legs bent as if it was about to stand. The porcelain creaked, the sound low and unnerving, like the cracking of bones in the dead of night. Adam froze, his breath caught in his throat as the doll's eyes blinked, just once. A cold wave of terror washed over him. It's alive. The smile that had once been twisted into a grotesque mockery of happiness stretched even further, like a slasher's grin that only grew darker, more menacing. "No," Adam whispered, backing toward the door, his mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, that this couldn't be real. But the room, the air itself, had thickened, had become alive with an oppressive force, a presence that was too heavy, too thick to ignore. It wasn't just the doll anymore. The apartment itself felt wrong. The whispers returned, louder now. They surrounded him, echoing off the walls in a low, guttural murmur. They were coming from the doll, from the shadows, from every corner of the room. "You can't escape." The voice was a rasp, like it came from somewhere deep in the earth, crawling up from some ancient, forgotten grave. The words were clear now, heavy with intent, and Adam's blood ran cold. Escape? He didn't need to escape. He needed to survive. His hands fumbled for the door handle again, but it refused to turn. The doll was coming closer now, its body jerking unnaturally, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Adam tried the window, but the glass wouldn't open. It was like the apartment had locked him in, trapping him in a nightmare that had no end. And then the door opened. It wasn't the way Adam had expected. It wasn't the smooth turn of the handle, the familiar give of the wood. Number. This was different. The door opened with a loud crack, like a scream breaking free from the silence. The hinges groaned under pressure, as if the door itself was resisting, as if something else was pushing against it from the other side. The room, the apartment, didn't seem real anymore. The walls had grown darker, as though the very air had thickened into something tangible, something alive. The shadows had grown longer, more distorted, like they were trying to pull him in, drag him deeper into the suffocating void. that now consumed the space around him. The door stood open now, but the hallway beyond it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt hungry. And from the hallway, the whispering grew louder. "You can't leave." It was almost like a song now, a lullaby of dread that sunk its claws into Adam's chest, tightening with every beat. His hands trembled violently as they hovered near the door, unsure of what to do next, of where to go. The hall beyond the door was alive now, filled with that strange, pulsing darkness. But the worst part, the doll, it was still there. The doll's smile had stretched even further, impossible now, like it was reaching for him, like it wanted him to come closer. He couldn't stay here, not in this room, not with this thing. But then, before he could act, lights flickered, once, twice, 3 times. Each flicker seemed to bring with it something darker. And then it happened. The doll, no longer just a toy, no longer just a cursed object, leapt. It moved so quickly, so violently that Adam didn't have time to react. The doll shot toward him, its porcelain limbs snapping and cracking as it stretched across the room, faster than any human could move. The smile was wide, too wide, its eyes gleaming like black pools of nothingness. It was coming for him. And Adam knew, without a doubt, that there was no escape. The door was no longer an option. Neither was the window. His only choice now was to face the thing, the creature, whatever it was, that had taken over his life. The room, the apartment, the world. Everything was wrong. And as the doll reached him, he could hear the last whisper of the night. "Mine now." Adam couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, locked in some kind of stasis, as if the very essence of his being had been cut off from the world around him. The doll was in front of him now, too close, its twisted smile gleaming in the half-darkness, its eyes gleaming like black orbs, reflecting a darkness so deep, so cold, that he felt like he was looking into the void itself. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. Every inch of him was paralyzed, trapped in some terrible nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His thoughts were frantic, scrambling to find an escape, a way out of this suffocating blackness. The apartment was no longer an apartment. It had become a prison, a cage with no bars, no windows, only the suffocating air and the doll, the thing that had come to claim him. The porcelain face of the doll contorted into something worse than a smile. It was a sneer, something predatory, something alive in the most unnatural of ways. Adam could hear the soft crackle of the doll's limbs, as if the porcelain was changing, warping, twisting under an unseen pressure. The whispers were louder now, all around him, closing in, growing more frantic. "You're mine." The voice wasn't just in his ears anymore, it was inside his head, crawling beneath his skin, taking root in his thoughts. It was everywhere. It was him. It was the air he breathed. It was the floor beneath him, the walls, the very atoms in his bones. "I'll never let you go." The doll's hands, no longer just porcelain, but something more, reached out to him. It was moving again, faster this time. Its arms snapped forward like a viper striking, the creaking of the porcelain limbs almost deafening in the silence. The thing was no longer just a doll, it had become something much worse, something darker, with every moment, with every word it whispered. And Adam knew. He knew that there was no escape. The weight of the words settled in his chest, like iron chains wrapping around his heart. "You're mine." It was a promise, a certainty. The doll wasn't just attached to him anymore, it had claimed him. It had sunk its claws deep into his soul, and now it was pulling, drawing him in, pulling him toward the darkness that had already consumed the room. He tried to move, tried to scream, tried to do anything, but it was useless. His body wouldn't obey him. His muscles were frozen, his mouth dry, his mind slipping away into madness. Every flicker of the doll's smile felt like an eternity. Each moment felt longer than the last, until time itself felt like it had stopped. Then, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the sheer terror that overwhelmed him. Maybe it was the last remnants of his own will, but something deep in his gut told him that he couldn't give in, not like this, not without a fight. In a desperate, frantic motion, Adam finally managed to lift his arm, his fingers shaking violently as they reached out toward the doll. The cold porcelain, the icy touch, it burned against his skin, but he forced himself to grip it. He didn't know what he was trying to do. Fight it, crush it, throw it away, anything. But as his hand made contact, the doll's head jerked upward, its glassy eyes locking onto his with terrifying clarity. The smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, like a rift in the fabric of reality itself. A low, guttering laugh bubbled from its throat, a laugh that echoed off the walls, a laugh that shook the very air. "You can't win," the doll whispered, its voice now a guttural rasp that scraped against Adam's soul. "You're already mine." He gritted his teeth, shaking with the effort, trying to break free. But the doll's grip on him was unrelenting. His fingers slid over its face, feeling the texture of the porcelain, so smooth, so cold, until they finally found something beneath. Something soft, a seam. It was the smallest detail, one he had missed when he had first touched it, but now that he had found it, he couldn't look away. It was a crack, a small break in the porcelain, like the first hint of a fracture in the surface of something broken, something ancient. His mind raced, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. What if this was the key, the crack? Maybe it wasn't just a flaw, maybe it was the doll's weakness. Adam's breath was ragged as he pressed harder, his fingers digging into the seam. The doll's laughter grew louder, more manic, its eyes widening as if it could sense what he was doing. But it was too late. With a final, desperate twist of his wrist, Adam pulled. The porcelain cracked under his fingers. A burst of cold air rushed from the doll's body, and he felt a jolt of energy, a spark of something dark, rush through him. The smile twisted, widening further, until Adam couldn't tell if it was laughing or screaming. The doll's body cracked open like a shell, and something else spilled out. A hand. A cold, thin, skeletal hand reached from inside the doll's hollow body, its long fingers curling toward him, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Adam recoiled, his skin crawling as the hand drew closer, but before he could react, the hand shot forward, wrapping around his wrist with a grip so tight it was like fire. The doll's eyes gleamed, alive, as the thing inside the doll pulled, dragging Adam toward it, pulling him into its depths. The air around him thickened again, heavier than before, as if the very walls were closing in on him. The whispers swelled, louder, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind. "You should never have tried to run," the voice inside the doll whispered. "Now you'll be mine. Forever." Adam tried to scream, but the darkness consumed him, swallowing his thoughts, swallowing his breath, until nothing was left but the oppressive silence. And then there was only the smile, the final smile of the doll, twisted and cruel, watching from the corner of his mind, where it would stay. Forever. It was late, far later than John had intended when he left the bar that night. The amber glow of streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk, their weak illumination doing little to push back the heavy darkness that had settled over the town. The air was thick with dampness, kind of wetness that felt like it would never dry out. Even the earth beneath his boots seemed to groan in the quiet of the night, its moisture holding the scent of rotting leaves and forgotten things. He had meant to catch the last bus, but his mind had been fuzzy with drink and regret. and the sudden downpour had left him stranded at the bus stop with no hope of getting home any time soon. So he had done what anyone in his situation might have done. He'd chosen a shortcut. The road through the woods was an old, winding path, narrow and barely a road at all, but it was a familiar one. John had walked this path more times than he cared to count, mostly in the daylight. But even at night, there was something comforting about the silence of the trees and the steady rhythm of his footsteps. His phone was dead. He couldn't remember the last time he'd charged it, and that made him a little uneasy, but he kept walking, telling himself that it didn't matter. There were no streetlights here, no signs of life, except for the occasional rustle of an animal in the brush. He had made this trek in worse conditions before. He had no real reason to fear the woods. The worst that had happened in all his years of walking this road were the occasional scrape of his jacket against the rough branches of the trees or the distant screech of an owl. But tonight was different. He couldn't say exactly what it was. Maybe the wind that had kicked up suddenly, swirling through the branches, or the unsettling stillness of the air. No, it was more than that. It was an unease that clung to him, a sense of being watched, of something just beyond his vision. It was a vague, creeping feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach, making the road stretch out before him like an unspoken threat. But John didn't stop walking. He couldn't afford to. The trees around him towered above, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the dim moonlight. Each step he took seemed to push the darkness further behind him, but it didn't feel like enough. The forest was alive somehow, its dark spaces teeming with strange things that lurked just beyond the reach of light. As the night wore on, his thoughts began to blur, his mind racing with memories and regrets he'd rather not face. His last few months had been a mess. The divorce had taken everything from him, his sense of direction, his friends, his home, and now the emptiness was suffocating him, dragging him deeper into the woods of his own mind. He thought he could outrun it, but the further he walked, the more he felt the weight of it, settling on his shoulders like a cloak of fog. His footsteps quickened. The road was narrowing now, the trees pressing in around him like dark sentinels. The road was more of a trail now, worn down by years of neglect and the weight of time. There was something unnerving about the stillness of the woods, the absence of the usual night sounds that accompanied a stroll through the trees. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, only silence. John pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to shake off the growing sense of discomfort. Maybe it was just the booze, still lingering in his system, or the isolation that came with wandering down a lonely path in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that. He was being followed. At first, he dismissed the feeling. It was probably just his imagination, or the wind playing tricks on him. But the sensation lingered, an itch at the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. His steps faltered, his eyes darting nervously to the left and right, where the trees seemed to crowd in even more closely now. The path had all but disappeared into the dense undergrowth, but he kept walking, his pace quickening, despite the creeping dread in his chest. Suddenly the silence broke. A snap. A twig cracked underfoot. No, not under his foot. Someone or something was behind him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stopped dead in his tracks. The sound wasn't just distant, it was right there in the trees, a breath away. John spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing. The woods lay still, stretching out into the shadows, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound. He waited, breath held, but the silence came again. Thick, oppressive, nothing. He took another cautious step backward, another snap. This time louder, closer, like something was walking in his direction, but keeping just out of sight. The rustling came again, this time from behind the dense foliage. He couldn't see anything, but he felt it. Something moving, something following. Get a grip, he told himself. It's nothing, just the wind. But even as he whispered it, he knew it wasn't true. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket for his phone, but it was useless. The screen had died hours ago. He'd have to rely on his instincts, or whatever sense of survival he had left. The road stretched on ahead, but something felt off about it now. There were no signs marking the way, no familiar markers to guide him. The trees were beginning to look strangely alike, no differentiation between one branch and the next. The world around him was slipping into a kind of warped monotony, as though the woods were closing in, pushing him down a path that had no end. He pressed on, trying to move faster, but his legs felt heavy. The trees seemed to loom over him now, casting long, twisted shadows that clawed at his skin. It was as if the entire forest was alive, breathing, watching him. Then, just when John was about to turn back, just when he had almost convinced himself that he should have taken the bus after all, he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something out of the corner of his eye. A shape, standing still in the distance, framed by the moonlight. It was a person, or at least, it looked like a person. They were standing in the middle of the road, waiting. John froze. The figure didn't move, didn't even twitch. They were just standing there, unmoving in the center of the path, their outline barely discernible in the fog of the night. But they were there, alive, real, and waiting. The air around him shifted. The uneasy feeling that had been building in his chest flared, now blossoming into a full-blown panic. He couldn't see their face, but something about the stillness of their presence made his skin crawl. John hesitated. Should he approach? Should he call out? His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to retreat, but his legs were frozen. There was something about that figure, something cold and commanding, that made him unable to move. And then, just as he had almost convinced himself that the figure was simply a figment of his tired, foggy mind, it moved, just a twitch, but enough to make his heart drop. And with it, the road seemed to stretch on forever, the path now unwinding ahead of him like a riddle he couldn't solve. John stood there, frozen in place, staring at the figure in the distance. He couldn't make out any details, not the clothes, not the face, nothing. But there was an undeniable presence there, something so solid, so unyielding, felt like the very air around him had thickened. The wind had died down, the trees had stopped rustling. There was only silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're waiting for something you're not supposed to hear. The figure hadn't moved since John first saw it. It remained perfectly still, standing at the edge of the road, as though waiting for something, or someone. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His heart was pounding against his chest now, the blood rushing in his ears. Every instinct told him to turn around, to forget this whole mess, and head back the way he'd come. It was too late. The darkness in the woods had swallowed everything, every trace of the familiar, every hint of escape. He was trapped. But he couldn't make himself move. He didn't know why. There was something magnetic about the figure, something that held him there in place, staring into the shadows. And then after what felt like an eternity, the figure shifted. Just a slight movement, just enough for John to know that it wasn't some trick of the light. The figure was alive. It was waiting for him. His pulse quickened. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but his legs were as heavy as lead, frozen in place by some invisible force. His breath hitched in his throat as the figure took a slow step forward. The movement was so deliberate, so unnatural, that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up straight. The road felt longer now, endlessly long, as if the distance between him and the figure was stretching farther with every step it took. John blinked, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a never-ending labyrinth of trees and shadows. He took a step forward, then another. Before he knew it, his legs were moving on their own, carrying him toward the figure. His mind screamed for him to stop, but his body ignored it, moving toward the unknown, toward whatever stood at the end of the road. He couldn't explain it. It was as though some strange compulsion had overtaken him, drawing him toward that silent figure. The closer he got, the less he could see. Everything in his line of sight seemed to blur, to distort, as though the world itself was warping. The moon above was obscured by clouds, casting the path into shadow. The trees grew darker, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers, scraping at the night sky. His breath quickened, his chest tightening with each step. And still, the figure didn't move. John was only a few yards away now, close enough that he could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him. He could almost make out the details of the figure, its outline, its shape, but everything was still too hazy, too distant. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to ask what the hell this was. But the words, stuck in his throat, lodged there like stones. The air grew colder. A chill seeped into his skin, a biting cold that made his teeth chatter. His hands trembled as they reached for the collar of his jacket, pulling it tighter around him. The figure remained still, as if oblivious to his approach, its face still hidden in shadow. John stopped a few feet away, unable to move any closer. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, wrapping itself around his chest like a vice. Something wasn't right. Something was off. "I'm not," he started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. Who are you?" The words echoed in the silence, swallowed by the woods around him. The figure did not respond. It didn't even twitch. John's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as a sudden wave of nausea hit him. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The figure took another step. It was closer now, close enough that John could see the shape of its body, a thin, almost skeletal silhouette. Its arms hung at its sides, stiff and unnatural. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure tilted its head to one side, as if it were studying him. John's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. He was trapped now. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape. He was at the mercy of whatever this thing was. The figure's head tilted farther, its body bending at an unnatural angle. A crackling sound like the snap of bones breaking echoed through the air. "You shouldn't have come this way," a voice whispered. The sound was low and distorted, as if the words were being spoken from far away, from somewhere beyond the edges of reality. John's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen the figure's mouth move. There was no way it could have spoken. He had been staring directly at it. But the voice had come, nevertheless. "It's too late for you." John's stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out along his spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find some kind of explanation for the figure that now stood before him. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the truth was inescapable. This was no ordinary man or woman. This was something else, something otherworldly. The figure took another step forward. John staggered back, his feet slipping on the damp ground, his mind spiraling into panic. The figure didn't speak again, but its presence was overwhelming, like a dark cloud pressing in on him. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. His eyes locked onto the figure, unable to tear himself away. And then, suddenly, the road began to change. The trees that had lined the path began to twist and shift, their gnarled branches reaching outward like claws. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and wobble, the familiar trail warping into something unfamiliar, something wrong. John stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The figure didn't seem to notice. It stood there, unmoving, as the world around it morphed and twisted, the road stretching farther and farther into the darkness, the trees surrounding them closing in. John wanted to scream, to shout, but the words died in his throat. His mouth was dry, his heart pounded, the air grew colder still. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the road straightened again. The trees receded back into the darkness, and everything was still, except for the figure. John's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was no longer on the same road. It had changed. The trees, the path, the very landscape around him. It was all different now, somehow twisted, as though the world itself had reset, but with no way to escape. The figure remained in front of him, silent and unmoving. It was still waiting. John's heart raced as his mind tried to process the impossible. The road had shifted, reshaped itself before his very eyes. The trees, the sky, the very atmosphere around him felt wrong. It wasn't just that it was dark. No, it was something far deeper than that, something malevolent, something that wanted to keep him here in this endless stretch of road. He took a step back, his legs trembling beneath him, but the figure, the one that had never once moved except to tilt its head, remained as still as ever. Every instinct within him screamed at him to run, to flee this nightmare. But where would he go? He had seen the trees close in behind him, and now, even though the road ahead seemed open, it felt like it had no end. A faint whisper of wind lifted the hairs on the back of his neck, but even the wind seemed wrong. It didn't carry the normal scent of trees and damp earth. It was thick, suffocating, and smelled faintly of rot. "Why are you following me?" John muttered to himself, his voice a raspy whisper that barely reached his own ears. He stared at the figure. It hadn't moved since it spoke. Its eyes, if it even had eyes, were hidden in shadow, but John could feel them on him, watching him. The figure was waiting, and John was too, as though locked in some twisted dance of time, stuck in the space between action and consequence. Every beat of his heart felt like it was pounding in a distant room, too far away to escape, too close to ignore. And then, as if the woods itself had been holding its breath, the figure's body shifted again. But it was not the slow, deliberate motion that had marked its previous movements. This time it was faster, unnaturally so. John barely had time to flinch before the thing moved toward him, its form stretching, elongating, its body twisting as though it was reaching out, pulling itself toward him. John stumbled backward, his legs refusing to obey him. He tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, his palms scraping against the cold, rough earth. Pain shot through his wrists, but it was nothing compared to the terror coursing through him as the figure loomed above. It was closer now, only a few feet away, and John could see something new in its silhouette. A flicker of movement, a flash of pale, smooth skin, and then the thing's mouth opened. It wasn't a mouth at all. At least it didn't resemble one. It was an opening, a wide, gaping abyss filled with darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the very air. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the ground, shaking John's bones. The noise seemed to come from within the thing itself, as if it was not speaking at all, but screaming from some unfathomable place. Get up! Get up! His mind screamed, but his body refused. His hands were trembling uncontrollably as he pushed himself back into a sitting position, his breath coming in short, painful bursts. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of anymore. The figure, the woods, or the sense of losing himself, of losing everything to a road that never ended. The figure's presence was suffocating, pressed in on him, its shape looming as the woods behind it seemed to stretch impossibly. The trees bent unnaturally, their trunks twisting like gnarled fingers, reaching for the sky, and John swore he could see them shifting, swaying toward him in some slow, predatory movement. He stumbled to his feet, his legs like rubber beneath him, and finally managed to force himself to run. But the road didn't let him escape. His feet pounded against the earth, and yet, no matter how fast he moved, the woods around him never changed. The same twisted trees, the same eerie silence, the same ever-present sense of wrongness. It was as though the ground itself was pulling him back, as if there was no place to go but forward, always forward. He tried not to look back, but his eyes kept flicking toward the figure. It wasn't moving, but it was there, still standing in the middle of the road. He couldn't make out any features. He didn't want to make out any features, but the presence of it was undeniable. The feeling that it was watching, that it was waiting, never left him. How much longer? How much further? He glanced over his shoulder just for a moment, but the figure was gone. In its place, the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, as though it was being swallowed by the dark horizon, never ending, never changing. But he didn't feel a sense of relief. Instead, the absence of the figure felt even worse, like it was right behind him now, closer than it had ever been before. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he wiped his brow, feeling the slickness of sweat on his skin, even though the air felt colder than it should have. His shoes slipped on the wet ground as he pushed himself forward, forcing his legs to move, even as they begged for him to stop. Suddenly there was a shift in the air, a subtle change, like the pressure in the room had changed. John's stomach flipped, a sensation of vertigo flooding his mind, and he tried to steady himself, but it felt like the very ground had tilted beneath him. He swayed, trying to regain his balance, but everything felt off. The road, the trees, everything felt wrong. And then he saw it. Just ahead, the silhouette of the road twisted, bending as though it had taken on a life of its own. The trees that had once formed a neat line to either side of the path had become tangled, their trunks thick and knotted. The path itself was narrowing. The woods pressed in, and John's chest tightened with a feeling of dread so deep it nearly crushed him. He had to stop. He had to... Don't stop. A whisper, faint and insidious, slithered through his thoughts. John froze. The voice wasn't the figure's voice, but it was there, echoing inside his mind, sending a chill down his spine. His hands went cold, and for a moment he felt like the world had gone silent again, like he was suspended in time. Don't stop. The voice came again, louder this time, though it was still not a voice, more a whisper than anything. He felt the pressure of it in his chest, like it was pushing against him from the inside, squeezing the air out of his lungs. He had to keep walking. His legs moved again against his will, carrying him forward. There was nothing else to do. The trees loomed higher now, bending over the path in unnatural arcs, casting long, claw-like shadows that danced in the moonlight. The road twisted, warped, and then, just when he thought it would swallow him whole, the figure appeared again, standing ahead of him, waiting. John gasped, his heart lurching. It was closer now, closer than before. Its silhouette was clearer, its edges sharper, and its presence was heavier, suffocating. And now he could hear it, the whisper again growing louder. "You should have never come." John stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest as the figure came into sharper view. It stood in the same position as before, but now there was a strange clarity to its outline, a presence that made the air itself feel suffocating. He could hear the whisper again, louder now, a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a sensation, a presence in his mind. "You should have never come." The words were chilling, wrapped in a kind of predatory malice, the kind of voice that made every instinct in John's body scream at him to run. But there was nowhere to run. There was nothing but the road and the trees that closed in around him like a labyrinth with no exit. He had already tried to turn back, but the road had changed, twisted, stretched, pulling him deeper into the forest, and now every step he took forward felt like he was being drawn closer to the heart of something ancient. John tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but his mouth was dry, his tongue thick against the roof of his mouth. His legs trembled beneath him, and his breath came in ragged gasps as the figure took a slow step toward him, its movements jerky like it wasn't entirely human. His eyes darted from the figure to the road behind him. The world had changed again. The path he had come from had disappeared, swallowed by the thick trees. There was no way back, no escape. It's not real. None of this is real. The thought kept repeating in his mind like a mantra, a desperate attempt to convince himself that this nightmare could somehow be explained, that there was a rational explanation for what was happening, but nothing made sense. Every time he blinked, the world shifted slightly, and each blink felt like an eternity. The road he had walked down for what felt like days had now transformed, like it was alive, adapting to his movements, guiding him or trapping him. The figure spoke again, its voice as soft as the wind but colder than the darkest night. "Why do you keep walking?" John's breath caught in his throat. The figure's voice seemed to resonate deep within him, like the words were coming from a place far beyond his understanding, beyond his mind, but it was impossible to ignore. He felt it wrapping around him, crawling beneath his skin, forcing him to face whatever this thing was. "I didn't mean to," John choked out, the words barely audible. "It's too late for that." The figure stepped forward again, its movements slow but relentless. It was closer now, the shadow of it creeping over John's body, an unnatural cold that clung to him. The air itself felt heavier, like a great weight pressing down on his chest, and he gasped for air, but it was hard to breathe. The figure's eyes, John still couldn't see them, but he felt them, were watching him, studying him. It wasn't human, and it wasn't something he could even begin to comprehend. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was older than the trees surrounding them, older than the very earth beneath his feet. It was a presence that stretched back through time, its roots buried deep in the darkness that lived just beyond the edge of human understanding. John staggered back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He couldn't keep looking at it. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. But the figure was not done with him yet. It continued to advance, its presence suffocating, its form twisting in unnatural ways, growing taller, growing darker, like a nightmare taking shape in the darkness. "You can't leave." The words hit him like a physical blow, shaking him to his core. John staggered again, his feet moving without thinking, moving backward. The road never let him leave. The figure was there, always in front of him, like a shadow he could never outrun, never escape. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the keys to his car. A moment of clarity, he could get to the car, drive away, leave this cursed place behind. But then, before he could even take a step in the direction of the car, the trees shifted again, the path narrowing, closing in. There was no car, there was no way out. The road twisted, bent and reshaped itself before his eyes. The world had folded in on itself like a broken piece of paper, and John realized with a deep, sickening certainty that he was trapped. The figure was still there watching him. Its twisted form, its sharp edges, its inhuman stance. It was impossibly close now, and it was smiling. Not with a mouth, but with something far worse. A presence that radiated malice. An invisible grin that John could feel against his skin, like a cold hand pressed against the back of his neck. "You will stay here, forever." The words weren't spoken aloud, but John heard them as clearly as if they had been shouted. He couldn't escape. The realization slammed into him like a freight train, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to the earth, fingers clawing at the dirt, as if he could dig his way out, as if there was a way to break free. But the ground beneath him was solid, unmovable. The road had become a prison, and he was its captive. His head spun. The trees seemed to pulse, the shadows flickering around him like living things, reaching out, touching him with their dark fingers. The wind howled through the branches, a mournful sound that echoed in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The words spilled from his lips before he even realized he had spoken. He was beyond reason now, beyond the point where he could understand what was real and what wasn't. He had lost track of time. He didn't know if he had been walking for hours, days, or years. The world around him was slipping away, and the figure was all that was left. And then suddenly there was a shift, a slight change in the air, like a door opening, a crack in the wall, an opportunity to break free. The figure paused. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to make a choice. John's hands clenched into fists, his breath ragged as he struggled to control the panic that was bubbling up inside him. He wasn't sure if this was real, if he was dreaming, or if he had truly lost his mind. But there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty. It's not over. The road ahead twisted again, but this time John didn't wait for the figure to make its next move. His feet found the ground beneath him, and with every ounce of strength he had left, he pushed forward, toward the twisted trees, toward the endless road that refused to let him go. He couldn't stop, not yet. John's pulse thrummed in his ears as he stumbled forward, his legs nearly buckling beneath him, the weight of the figure's presence pressing down on him like 1,000 invisible hands. The road was alive. Every step he took seemed to make the trees around him shift, bend, and grow taller. They seemed to lean in toward him, watching him with eyes he could not see, but felt deep in his bones. The whispering wind picked up again, carrying that suffocating, haunting voice. "You can't leave. Not now, not ever." The words were like poison, sinking deep into his chest, tightening around his lungs. The figure wasn't far behind him. He could feel it, its presence a shadow lurking just out of sight, but always there, never leaving. It was as if it were tethered to him, as though his every move only brought it closer. But no matter how fast he moved, the road stretched endlessly in front of him, never offering any sign of escape. He ran faster now, but his legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The harder he tried to push forward, the more his body seemed to resist him, like the earth itself was conspiring to pull him back. The trees, once familiar and comforting, had turned into twisted silhouettes, their limbs like skeletal hands reaching out to drag him into the darkness. Their shadows clung to him, crawling up his legs and wrapping around his torso as if they were trying to pull him under, into the very ground. But John fought it. He had to. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let this thing that haunted him, win. Then he saw it again. A glimmer in the distance, the faint outline of something or someone standing at the edge of the road. His breath caught in his throat, his heart leaping in his chest as he tried to make sense of the shape. It wasn't just the figure anymore. No, this time there was something new, something different. As he moved closer, he could see a flicker of motion, and then, as if the world itself had exhaled, the figure came into sharper focus. It was him. At least, it looked like him. The same silhouette, the same hunched form, but the eyes were the first thing that struck him. His eyes, the ones that had once been full of confusion and terror, were now filled with something else entirely. A blank emptiness, as though the very soul behind them had been hollowed out, erased by whatever force controlled this road. John's legs stopped moving before he could even tell them to. He was rooted to the spot, his breath shallow, his skin prickling with the cold that had begun to seep into his bones. The figure, that twisted, mirrored version of him, stepped forward, and John's heart skipped a beat. He felt the world shift again, the earth beneath his feet becoming unsteady. The road wavered, bending, as though it were flexing like a rubber band, pulling at the fabric of reality itself. And then the figure spoke. "I told you there's no escape." The voice wasn't his own. It was distorted like a shadow that crept into his mind and whispered things he had tried so hard to forget. The words were not just a statement, they were a command. John felt them rip through him like ice water, freezing his insides, numbing every part of him that had dared to hope. He had been running, fighting, trying to get away, but it was futile. He had always been walking this road, just as the figure before him had always been waiting. It was all the same, the road stretched on forever. And then, just as the realization began to settle in his chest like lead, the figure moved. Not with the slow, methodical crawl it had taken before, but with a sudden, violent motion that sent John stumbling backward. His feet slipped, his breath caught, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself as the figure raised its arms, the long, spindly fingers stretching toward him. The whispering voice returned, this time louder, more forceful. "You should have never come. You belong here now. This road is yours. It will never end. Not for you, not for anyone." John's vision blurred, his legs buckling beneath him as the world spun faster. The trees, the sky, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to melt away, transforming into something twisted and alien, something he couldn't comprehend. It was as if the world was folding in on itself, collapsing into a single point of darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. "It's all for you," the figure's voice hissed. John felt himself falling, not into the ground, but into something far worse, a void that had no shape, no form. His body, his mind, everything about him was fading, slipping away as the road continued to stretch, to twist, to bend into something that was both everywhere and nowhere. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, he couldn't remember how to scream. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had come, it receded. John gasped air, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up from the ground. But there was no ground. There was nothing. There was only the road, endless, unbroken, stretching out in every direction. And standing in front of him, just beyond his reach, was the figure. It was waiting for him to understand. John's mind screamed for him to wake up, to break free from whatever nightmare this was, but there was no waking. The road had claimed him, the road had taken his place, and now he was just another lost soul, doomed to walk this never-ending path, trapped in a world where there were no exits, no way out. The figure stepped forward one last time, its form growing darker, its edges sharper, its smile widening into something grotesque, something impossible. The eyes, his eyes, now stared back at him, empty and hollow, just as they had been before. The figure reached out, its hand cold and inhuman, as it took John by the shoulder, and the world around them shifted once more. This time, John didn't struggle. There was no point. The road was endless. The road was waiting. And as he walked with the figure, step after step, deeper into the darkness, he knew one thing for certain. There would be no escape. It was always quiet at night. Warren, the night security guard at the City Museum, found comfort in that stillness. The kind of silence that settles over a place after hours, deep, all-consuming, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a thick, suffocating blanket. He'd spent 3 years working the graveyard shift at the museum, and over time, the solitude had become as familiar as the creaky old floors he walked upon. But something had started to change, something Warren couldn't quite put his finger on. It started small, insignificant even, just a flicker at the edge of his vision, shadow where there shouldn't have been one. But shadows don't belong in museums, at least not the way he saw them. It wasn't that Warren was afraid, he wasn't. He had seen all manner of things during his time working nights here. Dust motes dancing in the flickering fluorescent lights, a stray rat darting between the shadows, the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. But recently, the things he'd seen at the edges of his vision weren't inanimate. They weren't dust or debris. They weren't even mice. They were people. Or at least, they looked like people. The first time it happened, Warren had been sitting at his desk going through the usual paperwork for the shift. It was a routine he could do in his sleep. Check the security cameras, walk the hallways, make sure the front door was locked, check on the storage rooms in the basement. Same old, same old. But that night, as he'd glanced up from his paperwork, he thought he saw someone standing in the far corner of the exhibit hall. It was a fleeting glance, just the briefest of moments, a figure hidden in the shadows. Warren's heart skipped, but he chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, he'd only had a few hours of sleep the night before, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead always played tricks on him. He'd written it off as a trick of the light and gotten back to his paperwork. But it happened again, and again. The second time, Warren had been walking the second floor of the museum, past the displays of ancient Egyptian relics. His footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space, and the silence was almost unbearable. He was used to it by now, used to the way the museum felt like it belonged only to him at night, like he was the last living soul in the building. But as he passed a display of mummies, relics frozen in time, their preserved faces twisted into eternal expressions of horror, he caught sight of something in the corner of his eye. At first, it was just a shape, something long and tall, standing by the entrance to the next exhibit. He turned, but the figure was gone before he could make out any details. Must be the shadows, Warren muttered to himself. He felt the familiar weight of dread crawl up his spine, but it was fleeting, easily shaken off. The third time, it was different. This time, the figure wasn't just standing in a corner, lurking in the background. It was moving, walking. Not fast, but not slow either, like it was purposefully walking, like it had somewhere to go. Warren was just finishing his usual patrol around the dimly lit exhibit hall when he saw the figure, a tall man in a grey coat, standing beside the massive glass display case holding a collection of Native American artifacts. The man was facing the case, his back to Warren. Warren froze, his pulse quickening. Who was that? He didn't recognize him. The museum was closed to the public, after all. No one else should have been here. The man didn't acknowledge Warren's presence, didn't turn to face him. He just stood there, motionless, staring at the display. Warren's mind raced. Was he a lost tourist, somehow sneaking in through the back doors? Maybe someone who was just as lost as he was in this massive museum? But there were security cameras everywhere. He'd seen no one on his rounds. No one had entered or exited the building since closing. A chill began to creep up Warren's spine. He cleared his throat, walking toward the man with tentative steps. "Hey!" he called out, his voice surprisingly hoarse in the silence. "You can't be in here. The museum's closed." The figure didn't respond. Warren's footsteps grew louder as he moved closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the walkie-talkie at his side. "Maybe I'll call for backup," he thought, but something told him that might be a bad idea. He was alone in this place, and something about the way the figure stood, so still, so unnervingly calm, made Warren hesitate. He took another step forward, and then it was gone. The man simply vanished before Warren's eyes, like smoke dissipating into the air. There wasn't a sound, no rustle of clothing, no footfalls echoing on the marble floors. One moment, the figure was there, perfectly visible, perfectly real, and the next, he was nothing but an afterthought. Warren blinked, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. Had he imagined it? Was it some kind of visual trick? He stood in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the empty spot where the man had been. His breath quickened, but his legs refused to move. "This place is messing with me," he thought, a cold sweat beginning to prick at his forehead. But even as he told himself that, a small part of him, deep down, the part that didn't want to admit fear, wasn't so sure. Warren turned and began walking back to the security office. He needed to clear his head. A cup of coffee might help. The museum was old. It had history, sure, more history than anyone could understand. And in old buildings, strange things could happen. He had worked here long enough to know that much. But no matter how much he told himself that, the feeling of dread, that nagging voice in the back of his head, refused to go away. As he made his way toward the security office, he glanced up at the security monitors mounted on the wall. The screen showing the exhibit hall blinked, momentarily fuzzy, before the image returned to normal. Warren stopped in his tracks. He squinted at the monitor. For a split second he saw it again, the same figure from before, standing by the display case. But this time, the figure wasn't alone. There were more of them. Warren stood frozen in the doorway to the security office, staring at the monitor. The image was flickering slightly, a blur of shadowy forms standing motionless by the display case. He leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. The figures were faint, just barely visible, like stains on the fabric of reality. But there was no mistaking the fact that the museum, his museum, the one he thought he knew like the back of his hand, was no longer empty. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat pounding louder than the last. He reached for the mouse to pause the footage, but his hand trembled so much he nearly knocked the keyboard off the desk. The figures on the screen didn't move. They just stood there, solid, unmoving, almost as though they were waiting for something. There was one tall figure in the center, a man in a dark coat, just like before. But now there were others, crowded around him, lurking just beyond the faintest flicker of the camera's range. Some were tall, others smaller, their shapes indistinct and hazy, like smudges on a dirty window. But they weren't ghosts, Warren realized with a sickening jolt. These weren't the things you read about in stories or saw on late-night TV. They were real, or at least they looked like they were. Their stillness, their unnatural silence, made them more terrifying than any phantom could ever be. He stepped back from the desk, the air in the office suddenly stifling. His throat felt dry, tight, as if the very walls were closing in on him. His mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation. Could the cameras be malfunctioning? Maybe some kind of glitch was causing the images to distort, to create the illusion of people where there were none. But the more he thought about it, the more the explanation felt hollow. These figures didn't belong in a malfunction. These figures weren't just pixels on a screen. They were real. Warren rubbed his face with one hand, then glanced over at the clock on the wall. The minutes seemed to drag, each tick of the second hand an echo in his mind. The museum was dead quiet, as always, save for the hum of the security system and the occasional whir of a fan. His shift had barely begun, but already the dread was crawling under his skin. I need to get this together, he thought. I'm just tired, that's all. I'm tired and I'm imagining things. But deep down, the gnawing feeling in his gut told him this wasn't the case. His eyes were wide, his pulse racing, and his every instinct was telling him that someone was watching him. Something was moving through the museum, hidden in plain sight. With a sigh, Warren pushed himself off the desk, the creak of his chair the only sound in the silence. He had to get a better look. There was no way around it. He wasn't the kind of person to run away from fear. He was the kind who faced it head-on, even if it meant stepping into the very heart of whatever dark force had taken root in the museum. He walked back down the hallway, the same path he had taken earlier. His footsteps echoed softly as he moved deeper into the building. The air felt colder now, and he couldn't shake the sensation that the museum had grown more alive, somehow. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching unnaturally long as if they were trying to reach out for him. As Warren approached the exhibit hall, the place where he had seen the figure earlier, he noticed something strange. The lights above flickered. Not again, he thought, his frustration mounting. He reached out to press the switch on the wall to restore the lighting, but before he could touch it, he heard something, a faint scratching, like something scraping against the wall. He froze, his hand hovering in midair, and the scratching stopped. Warren's breath caught in his chest. It's nothing, just an animal, he thought. Maybe a rat or a bird got in somehow. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew it wasn't that. The sound wasn't random, wasn't animal. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to draw his attention. Taking a step forward, he moved toward the display case at the center of the hall, where the shadowy figure had been. The exhibit itself was the one featuring ancient relics from a long-lost civilization, fragments of pottery, stone tools, and strange cryptic markings on aged parchment. It should have been one of the most peaceful rooms in the museum, a quiet space for reflection. But now it felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air turned thick with tension. Warren's eyes scanned the room, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing. No figure standing near the display, no movement, just the silence. He let out a slow breath and stepped forward, his hand reaching for the nearby light switch. But before he could turn it, something caught his eye. The glass case. It wasn't quite right. The case, which had been perfectly still the last time he'd checked, was now trembling. Not violently, but enough for Warren to notice the faintest vibrations in the air. The ancient pottery inside it rattled, and something, the smallest of sounds, broke the silence, a faint whisper, like a breeze. Warren froze again, his fingers hovering over the light switch. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight, and his mouth went dry. The whispering grew louder now, as though the very walls themselves were speaking to him. He slowly turned around, his gaze darting across the empty room. It was then that he saw it, a movement, just beyond the far corner of the exhibit, near the wall where the shadows were deepest. He squinted, but nothing was there. Wait a minute. Warren's mind raced, and then it hit him like a punch to the gut. The figures in the security footage, they were standing by the display case, but now The display case is trembling. He took a tentative step forward, eyes glued to the spot where the shadow had been. The scratching sound was gone, replaced by the creaking of wood, the sound of something shifting, moving inside the museum's walls. Suddenly, the lights above him flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The room was plunged into darkness, leaving him alone with nothing but the echo of his own heartbeat. He stood there in the void, trying to make out any shape or movement, but the blackness seemed to swallow everything whole. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and Warren's pulse thundered in his ears. He reached out in the dark, trying to find the light switch, but his hands brushed against cold, damp walls, as if the museum itself was alive, shifting around him. That's when he heard the footsteps, slow, methodical, heavy. They were coming toward him. Warren's breath caught in his throat. The figures were here, in the dark with him, and they were getting closer. Warren stood frozen in the pitch-black darkness, his every instinct screaming at him to move, to run. But his body betrayed him, frozen in place, each breath sharp and shallow as he listened to the footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming closer. His mind raced to explain the sound away, to convince himself it was just his imagination, or perhaps the sound of something, anything other than what he knew it was. But deep down, in the cold pit of his stomach, Warren knew better. These were no stray footsteps. These were footsteps that were meant for him. He could hear them now, closer than before, each step deliberate, rhythmic, as if the figure was savoring the terror it caused. The silence that had once filled the museum now felt hollow, as if the very walls were breathing with him. Warren's heart hammered in his chest, a constant thud like a drum of doom. He tried to move, to turn on his heels and run toward the security office, where he'd feel safe behind the thick glass, but his legs were made of stone. His mind was clouded, paralyzed by something he couldn't name. The footsteps drew nearer. He could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that he could see his breath fogging in front of him. It was unnatural. This wasn't just a museum. This wasn't just some late-night paranoia creeping up on him. Whatever was out there in the dark was real, and it was coming for him. Warren's fingers brushed the cold metal of the nearest display case, his only connection to the outside world, as though the relics within it could offer some form of comfort, some sign of familiarity in this suffocating horror. But all he could hear now were the footsteps closer. They were echoing through the room, louder and more distinct, like a man in heavy boots marching toward him. Stop, Warren thought. Stop this. Stop right now. This isn't happening. But no, it was happening. The steps continued, relentless, and now the hairs on the back of his neck prickled with the sharp, gut-wrenching sensation that someone or something was standing just behind him. Then the whispering started. Faint at first, like a breeze, but then growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't a voice. Not one he could make out, anyway. It was more like a murmur, an unintelligible chant, like the murmurs of 100 people speaking at once. The words didn't belong to any language Warren recognized, but they pressed against his mind, heavy and insistent, as though they wanted him to understand something he was too terrified to hear. The footsteps paused. The whispering ceased. There was silence again, so much silence that it felt unnatural, suffocating. Warren's heart was pounding in his chest, the thudding noise drowning out everything around him. He was trapped, he realized, not just in this museum, not just in this moment, but in this place, in this situation. He couldn't leave. And the terror began to set in, a deeper fear than he had ever known, the kind of fear that goes beyond panic, beyond fight or flight. It was the fear of being trapped with something beyond comprehension, beyond explanation. His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes darted around in the darkness, desperately searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, nothing to explain what was happening. The darkness seemed to pulse with its own life, its own rhythm, and Warren realized that the museum was not the only thing that had been transformed tonight. The world was changing, and he was at the center of it. A sudden chill swept through him, colder than before, and for a moment he thought he heard the faintest rustle of fabric. A breath, a sigh, and then, without warning, a voice, low and rasping, came from behind him. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were slow, deliberate, like they were being forced from someone's throat. Warren's body went rigid, his blood turning to ice. It was the voice of a man, or something that used to be a man, old and broken, but it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a weight. It pressed against him, held him still as if it had physically pinned him to the spot. His head swam, and the walls of the museum seemed to close in on him, the air thick and suffocating. He couldn't even move his mouth to speak. He turned his head ever so slightly, just enough to see the shadow in his peripheral vision stretching like a monster as though it was getting closer. "Who are you?" The words didn't leave his lips. He didn't need to ask. He already knew, whatever this was, this thing, it wasn't human. It was something older, something born of the walls, the halls, the very foundation of this place. It was the museum itself, alive in ways Warren could never have imagined. And it had been here longer than he could fathom. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. "You're not supposed to be here." It was like a chant, 1,000 voices layered over each other, repeating the same phrase in time, a mantra that echoed from every corner of the room. Warren couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. The air was thick, too thick, as if it was pressing against him, choking him, forcing him into submission. His thoughts scattered, slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. The words weren't just in his ears, they were in his mind, in his soul. Ground beneath him seemed to shift. Warren's legs buckled and he fell to his knees, his palms slapping the cold marble floor. His heart hammered, the sound deafening in his ears. He couldn't see anything now. It was all darkness, all shadows. But then in that darkness, he saw something. It wasn't a figure exactly, but a shape, a disturbance in the air. The edges of it seemed to shimmer like the flickering of a candle flame in the wind. It was moving, undulating in place like it was made of smoke, but the smoke was solid, real. It moved in a way that flesh should not. It came closer, and Warren realized, too late, that it wasn't just one shadow. It was dozens of them, swarming around him like insects. Their shapes weren't distinct, not at first, but as they drew near he could see them, pale faces twisted in expressions of agony, their eyes hollow, their mouths agape, speaking in voices that were not their own. Warren opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows surrounded him, pressing in, their cold fingers grazing his skin, their whispers echoing in his head. He wanted to run. He needed to get away, but the floor beneath him was solid stone, his limbs locked in place by fear, by something more powerful than his will. "You're not supposed to be here." The words came again, louder, sharper, as if the very walls of the museum were pushing them into his brain. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, trying to make sense of it. But it was useless. The museum wasn't just a building, it was a prison, and Warren had walked into its trap. And now there was no way out. Warren's chest tightened, his breathing shallow and panicked. The shadows moved around him like a living thing, swirling and shifting in the suffocating darkness. His heart thudded wildly in his chest. but no matter how much he tried to force his body to move, it wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by the overwhelming sense that the walls of the museum had come alive, that the building itself was aware, watching, waiting. The voices continued, those whispering, tortured voices, a chorus of suffering that crawled into his mind, burrowing deep into his thoughts like insects laying eggs in his brain. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were everywhere now, flooding him, drowning him, until the world around him became nothing but that single phrase. It repeated in time with his heartbeat, the sound of it growing louder and more insistent until it seemed to vibrate the very air around him. He could no longer tell if the whispers were real or if they were in his head. His eyes flicked wildly in every direction, trying to focus on something, anything that might offer him an escape. But all he could see were the shadows pressing in from every angle, the indistinct figures moving in and out of his vision like mist. The figures were circling him now, their forms blurring as they passed too close, the cold that emanated from them like a knife scraping against his skin. Warren's body was trembling, his muscles sore from the strain of holding himself still, but his mind was unraveling. The terror was too much, too deep, too ancient, too real. A figure appeared before him, tall and gaunt, draped in dark rags. It was close now, its features hidden in the shadow, but Warren could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on him. It was looking at him, its hollow, empty eyes piercing through him, not seeing him, but watching him, like something that existed only to observe, to wait. Warren's throat felt tight, the panic rising within him like a burning ember. He tried to scream again, but his voice was nothing but a croak, swallowed by the darkness. And then the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a force, deep and resonant, reverberating through the very bones of the museum. The words were alive, as if they had been spoken by the building itself. Warren's skin prickled, the hairs on his arms standing at attention. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't some trick of the light, some ghost playing games. This was something much darker. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally long as it bent toward him, so close that Warren could feel the cold from its presence seeping into his very soul. The room grew colder still, as if the temperature itself had been drawn into the void of the figure's being. He could see it now, faintly, pale skin stretched tight over a skull, eyes wide and hollow, empty pits where nothing could be seen. Warren tried to back away, but his feet were glued to the floor. His body wouldn't obey, his muscles locked in place by a terror that was older than the museum itself. He opened his mouth to plead, to beg for release, but no words came. Only the whispering, still echoing in his mind, now growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come." The words hung in the air like a promise, a threat. His chest tightened as a vision flashed before his eyes. He saw the museum, the real museum, the way it had been long before he ever stepped foot in it. The walls seemed to ripple with history, a history soaked in blood, in pain, in death. The faces of the people who had once walked these halls, long gone but never truly departed, flashed through his mind. Men, women, children, all trapped in time, their eyes wide in terror as they reached out for something they could never grasp. The museum had been built on the bones of those who had died here. And they were not resting. They were waiting. Waiting for someone like him, someone who had dared to take a step inside and disturb their eternal slumber. "You're not supposed to be here." The whispering grew louder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him, suffocating him under the weight of the voices. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a fetid, cloying scent that made his stomach turn. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for any sign of escape, but the shadows were everywhere, and the walls had begun to pulse, slowly, rhythmically, as if the building itself had a heartbeat. Warren's heart skipped a beat. He was surrounded. He was trapped. There was no way out. The figure in front of him stepped back slightly, its form dissolving into the shadows, leaving Warren with nothing but the crushing weight of the voices and the oppressive silence that followed in its wake. The air had gone deathly still, as though the museum was holding its breath. And then, there it was. A sound, a tiny creak, followed by the faintest scraping. It was coming from behind him, from the direction of the exhibit hall, where he had first seen the figure in the security footage. The scraping was slow at first, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Something's coming! Warren's breath caught in his throat. His body refused to move, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. The scraping grew louder, more urgent, until it was deafening in the silence. The shadows seemed to shift, grow restless, and then there it was again, that low, gravelly voice coming from somewhere in the dark. "You shouldn't have come." Warren tried to turn to see where it was coming from, but his vision blurred as the world around him began to spin. His body was losing control, his mind on the edge of collapse. Suddenly a cold hand, no, not a hand, something colder than ice, something that was not meant to exist in the world of the living, brushed against his cheek. He jerked backward, but the hand followed, its touch freezing his very soul. Warren screamed, the sound strangled in his throat, but it was too late. The darkness was closing in on him, the whispers filling his mind until there was nothing left but the sound of his own heart thundering in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. The museum had claimed him. Warren's scream died in his throat, smothered by the suffocating cold that enveloped him. The hand, no, the thing, hovered inches from his skin, its icy touch seeping through the fabric of his uniform like it was nothing more than paper. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but his limbs refused to respond. His mind was unraveling, fragmented thoughts and panic swirling in his head like a whirlwind. The scraping noise continued, louder now, closer, reverberating through the very bones of the building. It was as if the museum itself was alive with a dark hunger, something ancient that had waited for this moment, for Warren to step inside, for him to disturb the delicate balance of whatever nightmare had been woven into the walls. The shadows were closing in, swirling around him like a living fog, their whispers intensifying, rising into a cacophony of voices that pressed in on his mind. "You shouldn't have come." The words were everywhere now, inside him. He could feel them in his bones, in his chest, in his blood. He could hear the voices of those who had come before him, who had wandered into this cursed place and never returned. They were all here, trapped just like him. The cold grew sharper, like knives against his skin, slicing through his body and into his very soul. Warren gasped, trying to breathe, but the air had thickened, choked with the weight of it. He could feel the darkness creeping up his spine like a hand of ice, tightening around his throat. His eyes were wide, his mind reeling, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was no longer standing in the exhibit hall. The world around him had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, a ripple in the edges of his vision, but it grew, the walls distorting, stretching out of shape, like something was bending the very fabric of reality. His knees buckled beneath him and he stumbled to the floor, His head spun, his vision blurring as he fought to focus on something, anything, but all he could see was the endless swirl of shadows. The museum wasn't just a building, it wasn't just a collection of rooms and halls and displays. It was alive in ways Warren couldn't even begin to understand. It had been waiting for someone like him to fall into its grasp. He had read the files when he first took the job. The stories of accidents, of strange happenings in the museum, whispered in hushed tones by the staff. People had gone missing. Security cameras had caught strange figures at night, moving through the halls, vanishing without a trace. But no one had dared to speak the truth. No one had dared to confront the horror lurking beneath the museum's polished surface. Not until Warren. Now he was just another soul caught in the web, a soul destined to be trapped here forever, just like the others. He could feel it. The walls were pressing in on him, shifting, changing, pulling him into the very foundation of the building. The floor beneath him felt softer now, like wet clay, like the earth was swallowing him whole. His body trembled, and for the first time in his life, Warren realized the magnitude of the situation. There was no escape, no way out. A sudden flash of light pierced the darkness, blinding him, and he instinctively shielded his eyes. When the light faded, he was no longer alone. The figures had returned, no longer just shadows, but people, or what had once been people. They stood before him, their forms translucent and faint, but their eyes were clear, their faces contorted in agony. Some were dressed in tattered clothes, some in uniforms, others in clothing from decades past. They were all staring at him, their eyes wide with fear, with pleading. It was as if they were begging him to understand, to join them in their eternal torment. Warren's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figures moved towards him, slowly, deliberately, and he could feel the coldness of their presence seep into his skin. "You're one of us now," one of them whispered, a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. It was a voice that belonged to no one and everyone all at once. It was a voice that filled the space around him, pressing into his ears, into his skull, burrowing into his thoughts. The figure reached out, its hand like a shadow, cold and unyielding. Warren tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't move. The hand brushed against his forehead, and in that instant his mind was flooded with images, flashing images of the museum, of the halls, the rooms, the exhibits. He saw the museum as it once was, full of life, full of light, and then he saw the museum as it had become, dark, empty, alive. He saw faces in the walls, the broken bodies of those who had come before him, their souls trapped within the very structure of the building. The images grew more vivid, more intense. He saw himself, a part of the museum, bound to its walls, its shadows, its history. He saw his own face, pale and hollow, twisted in the same eternal scream of despair that the others wore. "We all tried to leave," the figure said, its voice a guttural rasp. "But we couldn't. None of us could." Warren's breath came faster now, his pulse pounding in his throat. His eyes were wide, the truth finally breaking through the fog of panic. The museum was not just a place, it was a trap that fed on the souls of those who entered, drawing them in with its promise of safety, of knowledge, of history, only to devour them once they had become part of its twisted tapestry. And there was no way out. The walls began to pulse again, the rhythmic beat of the museum's heartbeat reverberating through the floor beneath him. The figures reached out to him, their hands like chains, cold and unforgiving, wrapping around his body, pulling him deeper into the void. "You're not supposed to be here," the voices chanted, growing louder, more insistent. Warren wanted to scream, to fight, but he was already fading. The shadows were swallowing him whole, pulling him into the darkness, into the endless labyrinth of the museum's heart. His mind unraveled, the last fragments of his thoughts disappearing like smoke in the wind. And in the final moments, just before the darkness consumed him completely, Warren understood. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The museum had claimed him, and now he would be part of it, forever. The trees were thick. The air was dense with dampness, each breath a little heavier than the last. The smell of earth, hay, and old leaves mixed in the fog that rolled through the woods like it was alive, creeping slowly, silently, inching toward the horizon where the sun had long since dipped out of sight. A light drizzle fell from the sky, soaking the group as they trudged through the underbrush, their boots crunching against the wet ground. It had been an impulsive idea, one that had grown over several weeks of late-night conversations and too much caffeine. A group of friends, urban explorers, always in search of the next forgotten place, the next abandoned building, the next relic of a world long lost to time. They were familiar with the thrill of finding remnants of the past, old factories, decaying hospitals, even a few decimated homes that spoke of lives once lived. But this house, the one they'd heard whispered about in dark corners of the internet forums and local gossip, was something different. The house was deep in the woods, too deep, too far from civilization for any of them to have come across it by accident. It wasn't on any map, and no one had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. But the rumors were there. The house had burned down decades ago, a tragic fire that had taken the lives of an entire family, though no one seemed to know exactly when or why. The fire had left the house in ruins, a charred skeleton standing where once there was warmth and life. Or so they thought. But somehow someone who had been there, had left behind something more than the usual detritus of an abandoned home. "I don't know, man," Nate said, his breath misting in the chill of the forest. "I think we might be a little too far out for this one." Nate was the most cautious of the group, always the first to throw out doubts, to question the others when they got too reckless. He was also the most practical, which is why he had been the one to bring the GPS on the trip, the one to suggest they bring extra batteries, food, water, and an emergency whistle. But none of that seemed to ease the gnawing discomfort crawling under his skin now. The woods were too quiet, too still, and the air felt wrong somehow, as if it was waiting for something, like an old wound refusing to heal. Beside him, Harper shrugged, pushing a damp lock of hair behind her ear. "The thrill of discovery is why we're here, right? This is what we do. The house has been sitting here untouched for decades. How many times are you going to come across something like this again?" Harper was the daring one. She was the one who would always find the nerve to walk into the unknown, to press record on her camera, when everyone else hesitated. The other members of the group, Alex and Theo, shared her excitement. They had grown up together, making a game of sneaking into old, abandoned buildings to see what secrets they could uncover. They thrived on it. "It's just a house, Nate," Theo said, tapping Nate on the shoulder. "Not the haunted mansion from some bad horror movie. We've seen worse stuff, right? It's just an old building." He clapped his hands together to shake off the chill. "We'll go in, look around, grab some footage, and get out. Easy." Nate didn't reply immediately, though his unease didn't seem to subside. Something about the woods felt off, like they were walking through the remnants of a forgotten world, something ancient. The trees had thickened as they ventured deeper into the forest, and the canopy above them was so dense that the sunlight barely pierced through. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. It had been Theo's idea to bring a camera, something high-end, to capture the atmosphere of their finds. It was a piece of tech that had served them well in the past, immortalizing the decaying beauty of forgotten places. But this house had them all on edge. Their footsteps grew heavier, and no one spoke much after that. They followed the GPS for another 10 minutes, their path winding through the ever-thickening trees. Then, as if it had been waiting for them all along, the house emerged from the mist. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, a dark silhouette against the fog. But as they approached, the form grew more distinct, an old, decaying structure, its bones stretched and warped by time. The house stood crooked, leaning to one side as if the earth itself had decided to embrace it in its cold, decaying arms. The roof had caved in on parts, exposing the blackened rafters like broken ribs. The windows were boarded up, their glass shattered long ago. The door, hanging by a single rusted hinge, looked like it could fall at any moment. It was, as Harper had said, the perfect discovery. Forgotten, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. "Well, here we are," Harper said, with a grin that almost made Nate forget his growing anxiety. Alex was already moving toward the entrance, camera in hand, eager to document everything. He pushed the door open, and it creaked as it gave way, the noise loud in the otherwise silent woods. He turned back to the group, his face lit up with a mix of excitement and the satisfaction of victory. "Welcome to the past." Nate hesitated, standing just outside the doorway. He didn't know why, but the idea of stepping into the house felt wrong. His fingers twitched nervously, his mind flicking between thoughts of leaving and the desire to capture something others would never get to see. "You're not chickening out, are you?" Harper teased, pushing past him into the darkened threshold. Nate forced a smile, trying to shake off the dread creeping up his spine. "Number, let's go, just stay close." They entered the house, the air inside stale and thick with dust. The walls were covered in black soot, the remnants of the fire still visible in the charred beams that held up the roof. The floor was littered with debris, old furniture broken and overturned, long since eaten away by time and fire. The smell of ash and mildew made Nate's throat tighten, but he swallowed the discomfort down. "This place has been forgotten," Theo remarked, his voice echoing eerily in the hollow space. "It's like the world just let it go." They moved deeper into the house, each step feeling heavier, like the floor beneath them was softening with every footfall, as if the house was somehow sinking back into the earth. Alex was already setting up his camera, adjusting the lens, while Harper and Theo explored the ruins of what used to be the living room. In the corner, a large old television sat covered in dust and grime, the screen cracked and blackened. But it wasn't just the television that caught their attention. There, sitting beside it, was an old VHS camera. The red light was blinking, indicating that it was still recording. "That's odd," Alex said, kneeling to examine the camera. "It's still on. That's strange." Harper stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. "Who would leave a camera on in a place like this? It's been, decades since the fire." Theo crouched next to the camera, inspecting it as well. "You think it could be broken, just recording over old footage?" But there was something wrong about the whole thing. The camera wasn't new. It was old, probably from the 1980s, its plastic frame cracked with age. But it was running, capturing nothing but static on its tiny viewfinder. Nate watched from a distance, his unease growing with every passing second. Something felt wrong, deeper than just the strange occurrence of the camera running on its own. The silence of the house, the stillness of the place, it was as if it was waiting for them, watching them. "Let's play it back," Alex said, an eager grin forming on his face as he looked around for a VHS player. There was an old one on the shelf, dust-covered, a relic in its own right. The idea of watching the footage was almost too enticing. Maybe it would explain something. Maybe it would tell them what had happened in the years after the fire. Maybe it would make the house make sense. Nate, however, felt a creeping sensation on the back of his neck, as if something unseen had just reached out and touched him. But it was too late to back out now. They were already too deep into it. Alex pushed the tape into the player and hit play. The room was plunged into darkness, and the house watched. The flickering screen of the old VHS player hummed to life, casting an eerie glow across the room. For a moment, the footage was nothing more than static, fuzzy black and white snow, grainy and unrecognizable. But as the static shifted and swirled, it began to coalesce, slowly forming into shapes, and then into something resembling a living room. It was dim, darkened by the same decay that now filled the house, but there was something undeniably alive about it, something so painfully familiar. The camera panned lazily across the room, shaky, as though it had been handled by an amateur. The lens was unfocused, blurred around the edges as it moved, but the details were unmistakable. Old furniture, couch covered in floral patterned fabric, an ornate mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. And then, in the far corner of the room, a television, an old boxy thing just like the one they had seen earlier. It was set up in the same spot, in front of the same wall of fire-damaged wood. The footage seemed to linger, the camera slowly rotating as if trying to capture every inch of the room, every last piece of the past. Harper leaned in, her breath fogging up the screen. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, her voice hushed. Theo stepped forward, peering over her shoulder. "Old footage of the fire, right? You said this place burned down." "Yeah, but this doesn't feel like a documentary or a news report," Alex said, still staring at the screen. His finger hovered over the pause button, but for some reason he didn't press it. Something kept him transfixed, as if the video was pulling him deeper into it, begging him to see more. The camera was moving again, jerking slightly as if the person holding it was stumbling. The lens focused, capturing a doorway in the back of the room. The door stood ajar, casting a shadow that seemed unnatural in the light. The wooden frame was cracked, the paint peeling, but what really caught their attention was the figure that appeared in the doorway. It was hard to make out at first, too dark, too blurry, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person standing just beyond the threshold. A tall man, his face hidden in the shadow, but there was something unnerving about his stillness. He didn't move, didn't shift, as though he was waiting for the camera to notice him. Harper felt her breath catch. "Who's that?" she whispered, as if speaking any louder would somehow break the spell. The figure did not answer. It simply stood there, a black shape against the darkened hallway, motionless, watching. Watching them, or rather watching the camera. Then, without warning, the camera turned away, its lens spinning to focus on something else in the room. The image blinked out for a second, cutting to another angle, a shot of the floor, the ceiling, a table, and then it settled on a different scene. A fire, a blaze, flames licking at the corners of the room, black smoke curling into the air like the very breath of hell. It was all too familiar. The way the heat radiated off the screen, the orange glow that illuminated the charred ruins. The camera wavered again, but this time it wasn't a stumble. It was as if the person filming was actively trying to avoid the fire, as if they knew it was coming for them, knew the destruction was imminent. The fire grew, spreading with a ferocity that was almost unnatural, too fast, too violent. You could feel the panic rising in the air, the sense of urgency, of a life, or lives, being swallowed by it. And then, just as the flames seemed to consume the last of the room, the footage paused. The screen went black for a second, like someone had yanked the plug from the machine. Silence. Total silence, hanging heavy in the air like the weight of something forgotten. Nate, who had been standing back, watching all of this unfold, felt his throat tighten. Something about the silence was wrong, off. "Wait," he muttered, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding of his heart. "That wasn't supposed to happen. The house, it burned down, right? But this isn't the footage of the fire. This is..." Alex was already reaching for the remote, ready to resume the tape, but Harper stopped him. She looked at the screen, her hand trembling. "No way! Something's not right. Look!" Alex frowned and followed her gaze back to the monitor. The camera zoomed in on a face. It was disjointed at first, only half visible, obscured by the flames flickering in the background. But as the shot steadied, it became clear, too clear. The figure was still there, standing in the doorway. It wasn't the same person as before. This face, it was familiar. It was their own face. Alex froze. His heart seemed to skip a beat, his breath stalling in his chest. The face staring back at him from the screen was his own, disheveled, smeared with soot, eyes wide with terror. But it was impossible. He wasn't in the house when the fire happened. He'd only just arrived minutes ago, only just begun exploring. It had to be a trick of the tape, a coincidence. It had to be. But then something worse happened. The camera, as if on its own accord, panned across the room again. The lens shifted slightly, and just for a moment, just a flicker, it caught them. All of them, standing in the corner of the living room. Harper, Theo, Nate, and Alex. Standing completely still, staring directly at the camera. The room fell into silence again, the last remnants of their own voices swallowed by the dark. Harper was the first to break the spell, her voice trembling as she tried to find words. "What the hell is that?" Nate's skin was pale, his mouth dry, as he shook his head. No way, we weren't there. We weren't even in the shot." But they were. They were in the shot, in the corner of the room, as if they had always been there, caught in the same stillness as the figures in the doorway. Alex felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He tried to speak, but his words caught, tangled in his throat. That can't be us. This is from decades ago. This is impossible." The tension in the room was unbearable. They were no longer watching the footage in curiosity. They were watching it in horror. It wasn't just the fact that they were in the video. It wasn't even the fact that they were standing there, motionless, staring at the camera. It was the look in their eyes. Their faces were blank, expressionless, but there was something behind their gazes, something that flickered in and out of focus, something alive. And then, in that moment of frozen time, when the realization sunk in that they hadn't just stumbled upon an old video, that they hadn't just uncovered some forgotten relic of the past, the room seemed to exhale. It was a breath too heavy to be natural. The camera shuddered, and then, with a jarring lurch, the footage continued. The image blurred and flickered again. A new figure appeared in the doorway, this one unmistakable. A woman. But it wasn't just a woman. It was someone they recognized, someone who should not have been there, someone from their past. Theo's stomach churned. He felt the bile rise in his throat, a sickening realization creeping up on him like a nightmare made real. The woman smiled, and then the flames began to roar again, but this time the camera wasn't filming the fire, it was filming them. And they hadn't moved, not even once, but they were watching, always watching. And the house was waiting. The room around them felt stifling. The air in the decaying house, already thick with dust and the smell of mildew, now seemed to pulse with something darker. something heavier. As the footage on the screen continued, it was no longer just a recording. It was an invitation, a trap. Every flicker of the image, every sound of the tape spooling seemed to be pulling them deeper into the story, into the moment that had already unfolded decades ago. But this time, they weren't just watching history. They were a part of it. The woman in the doorway smiled at them, and it wasn't a smile that belonged to anyone from this world. It was a slow, deliberate thing, as though she had been waiting for the camera to notice her, waiting for someone, anyone, to turn around and acknowledge her presence. Her face was pale, too pale, the skin almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark pools, unblinking, unfeeling. Her hair hung in messy clumps around her face, wild and unkempt, as if she had been trapped in the house for an eternity. Who is that?" Harper whispered, her voice trembling. She had stepped back from the screen, her face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and growing terror. Her hand rested on her chest as if to steady her breathing, but no one had an answer. Theo, too shaken to speak, had moved to the corner of the room, his hands gripping the edge of a shelf, his knuckles white. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly would somehow break the fragile thread of reality they were clinging to. "There's no way. We can't be." The woman's smile deepened, her lips curling in a way that felt too practiced, too deliberate, as though she knew exactly what reaction she was provoking. Her eyes remained fixed on them, on each of them, one by one, and her gaze felt like ice, like something cold had seeped into their bones. Nate swallowed hard, his throat dry. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. This is a joke, right? Some kind of prank. We're being set up." But the words felt weak, even to him. He didn't believe them. Not anymore. The woman in the doorway tilted her head slightly and the smile on her face grew wider. And then something happened that none of them could have predicted. The camera's focus shifted. The woman, who had been standing just beyond the doorway, suddenly stepped forward. She moved unnaturally, as though each of her steps were deliberate, calculated, too slow, too heavy, like she was wading through a dream or a fog. The lens followed her as she came into full view. Her face was even more grotesque up close, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her mouth still smiling, but her eyes hollow, darkened, like twin voids that had sucked all the light out of the room. Harper stumbled back, her heart thumping in her chest. She's moving," she gasped, her hands shaking, pressing against the sides of her head, as if to block out the image. But it wasn't just the woman moving, it was the camera. The room they were standing in had no logical explanation for how the video was panning like this, for how it was zooming in and out, focusing on specific details with unnatural precision. The camera's movements were too fluid, too controlled, as though the person holding it was not just documenting the scene, but guiding it, directing it. And that's when they saw it. In the corner of the room, just behind the woman's silhouette, there was a figure, a dark shape, barely visible in the shadow, but unmistakable. It was tall, too tall, like a shadow that had grown beyond its natural form. It stood motionless in the corner, obscured by the smoke, but it was there, watching them. Nate's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to look away, but his eyes were glued to the screen. The figure, almost human but not quite, stood so still it was as though it had melted into the house itself. The woman's smile never wavered, but her eyes weren't just looking at them anymore. She was looking at something else. Something that stood with her, that towered behind her, something that had always been there, lingering in the darkness of the house, waiting. "I don't like this," Theo muttered, his voice strained, as if the words themselves were struggling to come out. He had backed away from the screen now, his body tense, with the kind of terror only a man can feel when he knows deep down that he's no longer in control of what's happening. "We need to turn it off, now." But Alex wasn't listening. He was transfixed, his hand frozen over the remote. He was watching something on the screen that made his blood run cold. The woman stepped closer to the camera. Too close. Her face filled the screen, too close, too detailed, her features warped and unnatural, as if the film itself was struggling to contain the horror of her presence. Her mouth opened slowly, her lips stretching wide in that same sickening smile, and then whispering. At first, it was faint, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice, a whisper, carried through the tape. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice like crackling leaves, low and haunting. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound of her voice was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. It wasn't just the tone, the words themselves, it was the knowledge behind them, the absolute certainty, as if she knew, as if she had been waiting for them to come to this very place at this exact moment, to see this exact thing. Harper gasped, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. "No, she whispered, backing away from the screen. "We have to leave, now!" But before she could move, before anyone could react, the footage took a darker turn. The camera, without explanation, shifted again. It moved from the woman's face, from her hollow eyes, and jerked toward the opposite corner of the room. The figure that had stood there, motionless, watching, was now stepping into the frame. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. But there was something wrong with him, something twisted. His skin was pale, but not like the woman's. It wasn't a deathly pallor, it was wrong. His flesh was drawn too tight over his bones, his limbs too long, his fingers too thin, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as he stepped forward. His eyes, however, were the worst part. They were not eyes, they were holes, empty, hollow black pits, and they were staring directly at the camera. At them. Harper screamed, her voice sharp and jagged as she turned away, her hands pressed over her ears as if to block out the sight, the sound, the unbearable knowledge of what she was seeing. But the tape continued. The house, it seemed, wasn't finished with them yet. And it wasn't going to let them leave. The room was cold now, not just the chill of the old house or the sweat-sticky chill of fear, but a deeper, bone-rattling cold that seemed to crawl up from the floorboards and sink into their skin. The weight of it hung on them, thick and oppressive, like something was pressing in from all sides. The air was too still, too silent. The only sound was the low hum of the VHS player, which had been running non-stop since they hit play, its clunky mechanical rhythm beating against the growing panic in their chests. But they couldn't turn it off, not yet. Theo, still standing back near the far wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if warding off the sensation of being watched, kept his eyes fixed on the screen. His gaze was hollow, empty. Something had happened to him when the camera had zoomed in on that figure, the man with the hollow eyes. Something had changed in the way he looked at the tape, as if it had unlocked a door inside his mind. His fingers twitched, ever so slightly, towards the remote. But it was as if his body wasn't in full control anymore. Harper was on the opposite side of the room, pacing in tight circles. Her breaths were shallow, her pulse pounding in her temples. She glanced at the screen every few seconds, as if afraid to turn away for too long, afraid that if she did, something would come out of the darkness to take her. The woman with the terrible smile, the man with the void for eyes, they were still there, burned into her mind, but it was the empty house around them that unsettled her most. It was too quiet, too abandoned. The house should have been a place of memories, of life, but now it felt like a tomb, a sealed crypt. Nate had collapsed onto the couch. He was holding his head in his hands, rocking slightly back and forth, murmuring to himself. He was trying to reassure himself that none of this was real, that it was just a trick of the light, some optical illusion. But deep down, he knew better. He had known the moment he saw the first flash of footage. They were never meant to find this place. They were never meant to see this video. What is happening? Alex's voice was strained, his mouth dry, as he stood frozen in front of the screen, watching it play on and on, the dark figures in the corners of the room still looming. He wanted to look away. He wanted to rip the tape from the machine and hurl it across the room, but his body was locked in place, paralyzed. The woman's face was still on the screen, staring out at them. Her smile had not faded, and yet somehow it had become even more insidious, more unsettling. She was not just smiling at the camera anymore, she was looking at them. Her eyes were still dark pits, but they held something else now. Something that wasn't just hunger or malice. It was recognition. She knew them. She had always known them. Then there was the man. His face, half hidden in shadow, had been watching them from the corner of the room. He wasn't moving, but his presence was undeniable, like a dark stain spreading across the room, seeping into the walls and the air. The longer they watched, the more he seemed to become real, to solidify. His tall frame, thin and skeletal, seemed almost to stretch, his head cocked at that impossible angle. The black, hollow eyes never left them. Harper swallowed hard. "Why are we still watching this?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, raw and trembling with a terror she couldn't control. "We need to stop it, now." But no one moved. The camera in the video, which had once been held so unsteadily, now felt deliberate, as if it had found its purpose. It focused sharply on the man, zooming in on the gaping black hollows where his eyes should have been. Then, without warning, it jerked again, snapping back toward the woman. But now she wasn't standing in the doorway. She had stepped closer, too close. She was inches from the lens, her mouth opening wide, wider than should have been humanly possible, her smile stretching and stretching, grotesque and hungry. The woman spoke again, her voice now unmistakable. "You can never leave." Her words were soft, like whispers in a nightmare, but they carried weight, gravity. Alex felt them hit him like a blow, his breath caught in his throat. "What the hell is she talking about?" he muttered under his breath, though the answer already gnawed at the edge of his mind. Deep down, he already knew. "We're trapped," Theo whispered, the words barely audible, his face pale. "We're trapped here." Before anyone could respond, the screen flickered again. This time, the footage didn't just jerk or stutter, it skipped. The image momentarily flashed black, like someone had abruptly turned off the power. And then, the camera was in a new position. They were no longer in the living room. Now they were in the hallway. The lens moved slowly down the narrow corridor, stopping briefly at the charred remnants of a door frame, the wood twisted and blackened by the fire. The remnants of the fire still smoked faintly in the corners, but there was no warmth, no sign of life. The camera lingered on the hallway as the sounds of something began to build in the background. It was a low hum, like an electric current, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. It vibrated through the walls, crawling up the spine, gnawing at the nerves, like the hum of some unseen machine, grinding through the silence. The door at the far end of the hall was cracked open. For a brief moment, the camera focused there, and then The door slammed shut, hard. The noise was deafening, and in that instant the house seemed to exhale a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the very foundation as though it had come alive. The woman's voice returned, but now it was distorted, garbled, as though speaking through a filter. "You shouldn't have looked. You shouldn't have come." The words twisted and contorted, smearing across the tape like ink running through water, bending and warping into something unrecognizable. Then suddenly the camera jerked again. This time, it was as if the lens was trying to escape, frenetic, shaking violently, as though the operator was running. But no, they weren't running. It was as if they were being pulled. And that's when they saw it. A figure, a shape, emerged from the darkness at the far end of the hallway. It was standing there, just outside of the camera's frame, waiting. They couldn't make out its features, but they felt it. They could feel its eyes boring into them like the eyes of the man, but worse. The pressure, it was too much. "Who is that?" Harper gasped, her voice rising, but she was speaking to herself as much as anyone else. The figure took one slow step forward, and the screen went black. For a long moment there was nothing but static, hissing, crackling white noise that screamed in their ears, stinging their senses. The television buzzed angrily, and Alex, almost without thinking, threw himself at the remote, frantically pressing the stop button. The sound died, but the darkness on the screen remained. And then, through the static, came a voice. It was quiet, almost too faint to hear, but it was there. "I've been waiting." The room felt like it was closing in on them. The once wide-open space, filled with the creaking and groaning of the old house, now felt suffocating. Harper, her back pressed against the dusty, peeling wallpaper, stared at the screen, her wide eyes reflecting the static that had consumed it. That voice, the one that had whispered from the blackened screen, still echoed in her mind. "I've been waiting." The words slipped through her thoughts like cold fingers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Too wrong. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the video. It was something bigger. It was as if they had unlocked a door, one they never should have touched. A door that had been sealed shut for a reason. She tried to steady her breathing, but it came in ragged bursts, her heart hammering in her chest like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the couch. She wanted to leave. No, she needed to leave. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the air, in the way the house felt. The sense of foreboding had thickened, turned tangible, like the walls themselves were watching them. Nate was the first to move, his eyes frantic as he scanned the room. His hand still clutched his head, as if trying to hold his thoughts together. We have to go now," he gasped, his voice hoarse. This isn't just a house. It's a trap." He sounded like he was speaking through water, his words muffled and distant, as though the very air had thickened around him. Alex stood next, his fingers still gripping the remote with an unnatural tightness, as though the device might offer some comfort, some protection. His eyes were wild, darting from one shadow to the next, never staying in one place for too long. He was trying to think, trying to make sense of what had happened, what they had seen, but he couldn't. Okay, Theo said, his voice quiet, but there was a sharpness to it, an edge. "We can't just leave, not like this, we have to—" He stopped mid-sentence, his words dying on his lips. His eyes had locked onto the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been, where the air seemed thicker. For a moment, it felt as if the house had shifted again, as if the walls themselves had moved, folding in on them like an ancient, hungry beast, eager to consume. The others followed his gaze, and they saw it. The figure from the hallway, the tall, thin, impossible figure that had lurked just beyond the frame of the video. It was there, standing in the far corner of the room. But it wasn't standing still anymore. No, now it was moving. The figure didn't walk, it glided. Its long, spindly legs took slow, deliberate steps, dragging it forward like a marionette, pulled by invisible strings. Its body bent at odd angles, its head jerking unnaturally to one side, the neck too long, too twisted, and the eyes, those empty, hollow pits, were locked on them. No longer a distant, vague presence, but here, in the room, with them. Harper's stomach lurched and she stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the couch. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. "Don't look at it," Theo whispered urgently, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would invite something worse. "Don't look at it!" But it was too late. The figure, whatever it was moving closer, closer still. Its long fingers reached out, tapping on the floor as it advanced, dragging its body behind it in a grotesque imitation of human motion. There was no sound but the wet, sticky scrape of its feet against the floor, like the sound of skin dragging over stone. The others were frozen, unable to look away, unable to run. Their bodies had betrayed them. The fear was too strong, too overwhelming. It was an invisible force, thick and oppressive, suffocating them, making their limbs feel like lead. Then, just as it seemed to be almost upon them, the figure stopped. It paused, its face still hidden by the shadows, and its fingers flexed. The room went deathly still, but Harper could hear it then. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails scraping on stone, echoing across the walls, was coming from behind her, from the direction of the door. She spun, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. Only the same decaying walls, the same dusty furniture, the same silence that had begun to press in around them. But the scratching was growing louder. It was coming closer. Harper's pulse pounded in her throat, choking her. Her vision blurred as panic surged up from deep inside her chest. "What? What is that?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She glanced frantically at the others. They were all looking in the same direction now, towards the hallway, where they had seen the door slam shut, where they had seen the figure disappear. And then it happened. The door at the end of the hallway opened, slowly, quietly, but it wasn't the door itself that made Harper's heart seize in her chest. It was what she saw standing in the doorway. It was the woman. The same woman from the footage. Her face, impossibly pale, her lips stretched into that terrible smile, her eyes dark and hollow. She stood at the threshold, her body framed by the blackness of the hall behind her, but her gaze was fixed on them, on Harper. Her eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made Harper's breath stop. The smile remained, but it was no longer inviting. It was predatory. "You shouldn't have looked," the woman whispered, her voice soft and cold, like a breeze through an open window. "Now you'll never leave." The walls groaned as if in answer. The house seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing. The shadows around them deepened, lengthened, and the air thickened even more, choking the light from the room. Harper felt as though she was being drawn in, as if the house itself was reaching out to pull her in, to consume her. And then, without warning, the television flickered again. The screen went black for a heartbeat, brief moment of silence that felt like an eternity. But when the image returned, it wasn't the same. This time it was live. The woman was no longer a figure in a recording. She was there, standing at the edge of the room, just beyond the camera, her face twisted in that same terrible smile. And behind her, in the shadows, behind her, in the hall. There was something else. The tall, thin figure with the empty eyes. It was no longer waiting. It was stepping forward, closer, closer, and the camera, now their eyes, zoomed in on the face of the woman, her smile widening, her mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Too late," she whispered. "Too late to leave." And then the screen went black. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of stillness that hangs in the air like an unseen weight, pressing down on you until you can't breathe right. It was the sort of silence that made you second-guess every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the window panes. It was the kind of quiet that made the shadows feel a little thicker, a little darker. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you're not quite as alone as you think you are. But it wasn't always like this. A few weeks ago, when the weather had started to turn cold and the trees outside had begun to shed their leaves, everything in the house had felt normal. The old farmhouse sat on the edge of a sleepy town, quiet, peaceful, nestled between a patch of dense woods and a field that stretched for miles. Perfectly ordinary. That's how it had been, and that's how it had always been. There were no strange noises, no eerie creaks, no sense of impending dread. It had been a place where a person could breathe, could exist without thinking too hard about what was beyond the safety of the walls. But tonight was different. It started with a knock. At first, it was so soft that it could have been mistaken for the wind or a loose branch tapping against the door. A faint, tentative sound, but then it came again, a single, deliberate rap, hollow and unmistakable, like someone was making sure you heard it. Theo sat up in the armchair in the living room, a book held loosely in his hands, but the words blurred in front of his eyes. Something about the knock felt wrong. He didn't know why. It wasn't that he was expecting anyone. He lived alone. The town had been quiet for weeks, with the exception of the occasional car driving past. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual humdrum of life. But still, the knock wouldn't leave his mind. He set the book down, the old leather cover creaking as it hit the side table. His feet were bare against the wooden floor, and the chill of the evening air made him shiver slightly. He glanced toward the window, but all he could see was the darkness beyond. The trees in the yard swayed lightly in the breeze, their bare branches scratching at the glass like skeletal fingers. He swallowed hard, and without thinking, he stood up and moved toward the front door. There was no reason to feel afraid. He told himself that as his hand reached for the doorknob. The house was old, everything creaked, everything groaned. It could have been a neighbor, or maybe a kid with too much time on their hands. Still, his heart was beating faster than it should have been, and a shiver ran up his spine as he turned the knob. The door swung open. There, standing on the doorstep, was a child. Theo blinked, his breath catching in his throat, as he took in the figure in front of him. The child couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with a round face and tangled hair that looked as though it hadn't been brushed in days. They wore an oversized coat that swallowed their small frame, and their hands were tucked into the sleeves, hidden from view. The child stood still as a statue, not speaking, not even moving. But it was the eyes. It was always the eyes. They were pitch black. The child's eyes, blacker than midnight, void of any trace of light, stared up at Theo with a gaze so cold it made his blood run hot with fear. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. There was something about those eyes, something that felt ancient, like they had seen things no child should ever have to see. They were too old for such a young face. For a long, breathless moment, the child didn't say a word. They just stood there, unmoving, unblinking, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, left to dangle in the wind. Then the child pointed. A single, slow, deliberate motion, their finger lifting in the air and extending outward toward the woods that bordered the property. The woods were thick, tangled with trees that had grown wild over the years, their twisted limbs reaching like gnarled fingers toward the sky. From where Theo stood, it looked like nothing more than a dense wall of shadow. The air grew colder. Theo's eyes flicked back to the child, but the child's gaze remained fixed on the woods. There was no expression on the child's face, nothing but the cold, empty darkness in their eyes. No smile, no emotion, just a sharp, unwavering gesture toward the forest. Something in the pit of Theo's stomach twisted. It wasn't right. None of this was right. What do you want? Theo asked, his voice rough, uncertain. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the wave of dread that had washed over him. The child didn't respond. They didn't even blink. They simply stood there, their small body barely visible in the dim light of the porch. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The longer Theo stared, the more he felt the unease creeping through his chest, tightening his rib cage. There was something wrong about this child, the way they stood there, the way they looked. "Hey," Theo tried again, his voice sharper this time. "You need to go home. It's late." But still the child didn't speak. They only pointed once again toward the dark expanse of the woods. The silence was unbearable now, like the world itself had stopped breathing, like everything was holding its breath. Theo's hand tightened around the doorknob, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly a distant howl pierced the night air. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the trees, but it grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a long, drawn-out scream, like an animal in pain, desperate and lost. Theo's blood ran cold. The child's finger remained extended, pointing toward the woods. They didn't flinch, didn't even react. Without thinking, Theo stepped back. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the frame, and he staggered away from it, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was happening, but deep down in the pit of his stomach, he knew. That child wasn't a child, at least not anymore. He didn't know how he knew it, but it didn't matter. It was an instinct, an awareness that flooded his senses. Something was wrong, and it was here. Theo backed away from the door, his breath ragged, and pressed his back against the wall. The child was still out there, standing, waiting. And Theo knew in that moment that they wouldn't be gone for long. The house felt different the next day. Quiet, yes, but there was a weight to it now, like a thick fog that lingered in the corners, clinging to the air, refusing to dissipate. Theo didn't sleep much that night. His eyes kept snapping open. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the woods had him on edge. He kept his back to the wall, the sheets twisted around his legs, as if the very fabric of his bed might somehow betray him. That child, the figure on his doorstep, was still there, burned into his mind. Those black eyes, the silence, the way it had pointed toward the forest without saying a word. No, not a word, just that cold, unwavering motion that had driven a nail of unease deep into his chest. Theo didn't know what had come over him. Maybe it was the isolation of the house, tucked away on the edge of town with no one around to help if something went wrong. Maybe it was the strange feeling that had settled over him, making his skin crawl, like he wasn't alone even when he should have been. But as much as he tried to push the memory of the child out of his mind, it was there, gnawing at him. And it wasn't just the child that haunted him. It was the woods, the way they had been so dark, so waiting. Something about them didn't sit right. The trees had loomed in the background like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches twisting like fingers, beckoning him. The howls from the night before still echoed in his mind too, distant and haunting. The second knock came just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the yard. Theo froze as he heard the faint, familiar sound, sharp, deliberate, like someone tapping their knuckles against the doorframe. Number no, it can't be. But it was. The child was back. Theo stood at the threshold of the living room, staring toward the door, his hand still on the edge of the armchair where he had been sitting just moments before. His pulse began to race again, quick and hard. He hadn't prepared himself for this. He wasn't ready to face that thing again. It had been a nightmare. It had to have been, but he knew it wasn't. It was real. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the chilling silence that sent shivers down his spine. Slowly, hesitantly, Theo moved toward the door. His legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath him. He reached for the doorknob with fingers that shook more than he was willing to admit, his breath shallow in his chest. The same dread, the same coldness hung in the air. "Don't open it," a small voice in his head urged. "Don't you dare, just walk away." But he didn't. Instead, he swung the door open, and there it was, the child, the same face, the same eyes, the same black eyes. Theo's breath hitched, a lump forming in his throat as he tried to steady himself. The figure stood there once again, motionless, staring up at him with that haunting, empty gaze. The child was still wearing that oversized coat, its sleeves hanging loose, the fabric dragging on the ground. But now, Theo noticed, the edges of it were frayed, torn, as if it had been dragged through the dirt. No, not dirt, blood. The thought hit him like a cold slap, and he recoiled, stepping back instinctively. His foot caught on the edge of the doorframe, and for a moment he thought he might fall. He caught himself just in time, his chest tight, his heart hammering in his ears. The child didn't speak. It never spoke. Instead, it pointed again toward the woods. Theo's throat was dry as he glanced toward the trees. The forest had grown darker in the fading light, the shadows stretching long and menacing, as if the very earth itself were trying to swallow him whole. The breeze picked up again, carrying the scent of damp leaves and something foul. It sent a wave of nausea through him, but the child didn't move. It didn't walk away. It just stood there, that unblinking gaze fixed on him, waiting, patient, hungry. It wanted something. Without thinking, Theo slammed the door shut, the impact echoing through the house like the bang of a gunshot. His breath came fast and shallow, panic clawing at the back of his throat. He backed away from the door, his hands shaking as they gripped the arm of the couch. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of more, the child or the place outside. For a long moment he stood there, paralyzed, the house falling back into its unnatural silence. His eyes flicked to the window where the last slivers of sunlight were beginning to fade. He could still hear the rustling of the trees, the whispering of the leaves, but it wasn't the wind anymore. It was something else. It was watching him. He turned toward the kitchen, trying to think, trying to gather himself, but his mind was spinning. The child, the woods, that sense of wrongness that gnawed at his stomach, but there was no escape. Not from the house, not from the child, not from whatever waited in the woods. It was all connected. It had always been. And Theo knew with a sinking feeling in his gut that whatever it was, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Theo grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and pulled it on, the fabric heavy against his shoulders. He made his way to the door, his feet dragging with a weight that felt like lead. He hesitated, his hand on the knob, staring at the exit as if it might somehow betray him. But there was no turning back now. It was too late. The knock came again. This time it was different, faster, more insistent. And if Theo listened closely enough, he could hear it through the thick wood of the door. A faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. "Come." It was the voice of the child, but it wasn't the child. Not anymore. Theo swallowed hard and turned the knob, stepping into the darkening world outside. And the door swung open. The door slammed behind him with a finality that rattled his bones, and for a moment, Theo stood on the porch, paralyzed. He stared out into the deepening shadows of the yard, at the twisted black line of trees that loomed at the edge of the property. The child, the thing standing on his doorstep, was gone. But the air felt heavier now, thicker, like something was pulling at his chest, suffocating him with the weight of it all. The woods were silent, too silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like it's waiting for something, waiting for you. Shio's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as he slowly turned, his boots crunching on the dry grass beneath him. Every instinct told him to go back inside, to lock the door and forget this entire nightmare. But something in the pit of his stomach, something cold and wrong, urged him forward. "You have to see this. You have to know." The voice in his head sounded like his own, but it wasn't. It was distant, as if it came from somewhere far away, but it was insistent, urging him, telling him to move. So he did. With his pulse thudding painfully in his throat, Theo walked toward the line of trees, each step slow, deliberate. The path wasn't marked, but he knew it well. He'd walked it many times in the past. He'd gone out to the woods as a boy, pretending to be an explorer, collecting rocks and sticks, imagining the forest was full of strange creatures that he would one day conquer. But this wasn't that forest. This was different. The trees seemed closer now, pressing in on him from every side, their skeletal branches reaching out like fingers, scratching at the night. He could almost feel them watching him. The earth beneath his feet was soft, damp, and every time he stepped, the ground seemed to swallow his foot, making him stumble slightly as he moved forward. The child had pointed toward these woods, and Theo had followed. But why? What was here? What had the child wanted him to see? There was no answer. Only the press of silence, the weight of the dark pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He heard it again, faint but unmistakable. A soft whisper carried on the wind, calling to him. It was the same voice that had urged him to step outside, the same voice that had whispered from the cracks in his mind. Come closer. Theo's eyes scanned the trees ahead, trying to pierce the veil of darkness. The farther he walked, the more the forest seemed to swallow him whole, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, sharp and sour, mingling with something rotten. His heart beat faster, each thud vibrating through his chest. His feet moved on their own now, no longer under his control, as if the earth itself was guiding him forward, pulling him deeper into the woods. The silence was deafening, suffocating. And then through the thick trees he saw it, a clearing. The edge of it was marked by a ring of gnarled, twisted trees, their trunks so thick and dark they seemed like ancient sentinels guarding something or someone. In the center of the clearing, a dark shape stood, but Theo couldn't make out what it was at first. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, unable to look away. The air grew colder, a sharp bite to it now. His hands were shaking as he reached up to wipe his forehead, but his fingers were slick with sweat, the cold of it stinging his skin. The forest was alive with whispers now, but they weren't soft. They were louder, insistent. Come closer. His legs moved and Theo found himself stepping into the clearing. The ground beneath him had changed now, darker, colder, slick with something thick and unpleasant. His eyes widened as he saw it. At the center of the clearing, there was a pit. It was small but deep, its edges jagged and uneven, like something had clawed its way out of it long ago. The earth around it was disturbed, torn, as if it had been dug up by something, someone impatient and frantic. And in the center of that pit there was something else. Something that made Theo's stomach twist violently. A body. It was only half buried, its limbs splayed out at strange angles, as though it had been thrown into the hole in haste. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, and its eyes, Theo's breath caught in his throat, its eyes were black, just like the child's. But this wasn't a child, it was a man. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by starvation or some other grotesque fate. His mouth was open, stretched wide in a permanent scream, but no sound escaped, and his eyes, those eyes, were wide open, staring into nothing, black as pitch, devoid of any trace of humanity. Theo staggered back, his hand flying to his mouth to suppress the bile that rose in his throat. What was this? Why was it here? Why was it pointing? And then he saw it. There, just beyond the body, half hidden in the shadows, was another figure. Smaller this time, a child, the same child. Theo's blood ran cold as the child stepped forward, its black eyes glinting in the faint moonlight, its face expressionless. It was the same child from before, standing in the clearing, staring at him with that same empty, unblinking gaze. No words came. Not this time. The child simply raised its finger again and pointed toward the pit. Theo's stomach churned. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating him, wrapping around his chest, making it impossible to breathe. His pulse hammered in his ears as the child took a slow, deliberate step toward him. One step, two. And then it smiled, but it wasn't a smile, it was a grimace. A sickening, twisted curl of its lips that stretched, too wide, too far, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. Its head tilted to one side, like it was curious about what Theo might do next. Theo's mind screamed at him to run, his body screamed to flee. But his feet wouldn't move. They were rooted to the ground like the trees had sunk their roots into his flesh, pulling him deeper, holding him there. The child's eyes never left him. And then, with one final drawn-out motion, the child pointed directly into the pit. Theo's breath caught in his throat. There was something in that pit. Something that had been there all along, something that had been waiting, and now it was calling to him. The pit seemed to swallow the light around it, the darkness in its depths pulling at Theo like a tidal wave. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, constricted by an invisible hand, and the air in the clearing was thick with the smell of decay, of something foul and long forgotten. His feet were cemented to the ground, his body refusing to move, no matter how hard his mind screamed at him to run, to get away from the nightmare unfolding before him. The child's smile, or whatever it was, remained fixed on his face, those eyes wide and unblinking, full of that same emptiness, that same cold, unfeeling void. Its head tilted slightly like it was studying him, as if his reaction to what lay before him was some kind of game. The pit seemed to shift like it was alive, breathing, its jagged edges moving ever so slightly as if something deep within it was stirring. And then, through the thickening fog of terror, Theo saw it. A shape. It was barely visible at first, just a sliver of movement within the blackness, but as Theo's eyes adjusted to the overwhelming darkness, he saw the figure more clearly. It was crawling toward the edge of the pit. At first, it was slow, deliberate, dragging itself through the muck and grime at the bottom, but then it picked up speed, scrambling, clawing at the sides, pulling itself closer. Theo's throat closed. He wanted to scream, to shout, to turn and run, but he couldn't. His body wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, like the pit was pulling him in, just as it was pulling the thing toward him. The shape emerged from the depths, its form twisted and broken, a grotesque parody of a human being. It was covered in what looked like blackened, scorched skin. The flesh bubbled and warped as though it had been burned in some unholy fire. Its arms were stretched too long, its fingers twisted and sharp, like claws, and its mouth was stretched wide, impossibly wide, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too many. The thing dragged itself toward the edge of the pit, its eyes, just like the child's, pitch black, void of any life, any light. It was an abomination. Theo's heart thudded in his chest, every beat echoing like a drum. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but it was impossible. His thoughts were jumbled, his vision blurring. The thing, whatever it was inching closer, and he could feel its gaze even before it was fully out of the pit. He could feel it, cold, suffocating, wrapping around him, pressing in from all sides. The child didn't move, it didn't speak, it just watched, standing in the shadows, those black eyes locked on him as the thing in the pit finally pulled itself over the edge and onto the ground. It wasn't just crawling anymore, it was standing. It wasn't human, it was something else. The creature's head snapped up, its neck jerking at an unnatural angle, and it fixed its black eyes on Theo. For a moment, nothing moved. It was as though time itself had frozen, and the only thing that mattered in the world was the connection between the creature and Theo. There was no sound, no wind, no movement, just the hollow emptiness of the moment. And then, with a scream that tore through the silence like a blade through skin, the creature lunged. Theo didn't know how he moved, but suddenly he was running, his legs pumping, his heart racing, his mind consumed by sheer panic. The clearing blurred around him, the trees whipping past as his feet pounded against the earth, but it didn't matter. He could feel it behind him. He could feel the thing's presence, its weight pressing in on him like a crushing force. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he was sure, just sure, that it was right behind him, its claws scraping against the ground, dragging its burned and twisted body after him. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. But then the ground beneath him gave way. His feet slipped in the loose earth, and he felt himself plummet forward. He fell, hard, onto the dirt, his palms scraping against the cold, wet ground as he tried to catch himself. His breath came in gasps, the air thick with terror, his limbs screaming from the impact. The child's figure appeared in front of him, blocking his path, its black eyes staring down at him, unmoving, like a ghostly sentinel. Theo tried to scramble to his feet, but his legs felt like lead. His hands shook violently and his chest was tight, his heart pounding against his ribs, but he couldn't move. The child's head tilted again, the smile, or the grimace, still frozen on its face. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Theo's blood ran cold as he heard it, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. The creature was close, very close. Theo turned and saw it then, emerging from the shadows, its burned face twisted into something unrecognizable, its mouth opening and closing in an endless, silent scream. Its claws clicked on the ground like nails on wood as it stalked toward him, its dark eyes locked onto his. His mind screamed at him to run, but it was too late. The child raised its hand. Stop! Theo froze. His body refused to obey, but he couldn't move. The command was clear, as if it was etched into his very bones. The child's black eyes pierced through him, and in that moment, Theo knew. He knew it wasn't just a child. It wasn't just an innocent figure. It was something far older, something that had been here long before he ever set foot on this land. The thing in the pit reached out, its claws dragging across the dirt as it drew nearer, but still the child's hand was raised and the creature stopped. Theo's mind scrambled for answers. What was this? What was happening? How had it gotten this far? How had it found him? The child's eyes shifted, and suddenly Theo could see the truth. The thing in the pit, the child, it wasn't just an isolated horror. Number. It had always been there, watching, waiting. It had been calling him all along. The woods, the knock at the door, the black-eyed gaze. It had been drawing him in. The child had led him here, had guided him to the clearing, to the pit, to the creature. And now Theo understood. It wasn't just a game. It wasn't just a visitation. It was a trap. And he was the prey. Theo's breath caught in his throat as the weight of the situation settled on him like a pile of wet bricks. The black-eyed child standing perfectly still, its skeletal hand still raised toward the monstrous thing that had crawled out of the pit, seemed almost calm. Its unblinking gaze bore down on him like the weight of an entire universe, suffocating and unbearable, its silence louder than any scream. The creature in the pit, the thing, stood motionless now, its jagged, malformed body shuddering as if held by some invisible force. It wanted him. That much was clear. Its black eyes locked on to Theo with a hunger so fierce, so primal, it nearly took the air from his lungs. Theo tried to move, but his body refused him, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The ground beneath him seemed to soften, the earth turning to quicksand, sucking at his legs, drawing him deeper into its grasp. His fingers scrabbled at the dirt, but it was no use. The terror, the pure, raw terror, had paralyzed him. And then the child spoke, not in words, but in something else, something far worse. It was a thought. You are here now. The voice, if it could be called a voice, echoed in Theo's mind, cold and hollow, like the last breath of a dying man, the words dripping with the weight of something ancient, something far beyond human comprehension. The sound of it sent a wave of nausea crashing through him, his stomach twisting into knots. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The creature, the thing, took a step forward, and the ground seemed to ripple beneath its feet. Each movement of its twisted limbs caused the very earth to groan in protest, as though the soil itself was trying to resist the horror that was unfolding. Its claws clicked together like knives scraping across stone as it advanced slowly, deliberately, its head swiveling toward Theo with a predator's focus. You have been called. Theo's legs trembled beneath him, but he managed to push himself up onto his hands and knees, his skin slick with sweat, his heart racing in his chest. It was as if something deep within him understood the full weight of the words. His body was shaking, his eyes darting from the child to the creature, to the pit. He couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. The woods, the clearing, the very earth beneath his feet. It had all become one giant trap, and he was the bait. The child took a single, slow step forward, its black eyes unwavering, its lips curling upward in that twisted, grotesque smile. You are mine now. Theo's breath hitched, the words reverberating in his skull. His mind screamed, clawing at him from the inside, but it was no use. The child's presence, power, seemed to radiate outward, filling the space around him, drowning out everything else. The very air felt heavy, pressing in on him from all sides, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. He thought he might suffocate. I was never meant to leave. The thought came suddenly, rushing through him like a cold wind. Theo's eyes widened, and he froze. What? The words weren't his. They weren't the child's either. The voice was deeper, darker, something that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. It was ancient, full of rage and sorrow, a voice that had been buried for centuries, waiting for this moment to return. I was trapped. Now I am free. The pit, the thing that had crawled from it. Theo's body shook violently, the weight of the realization crashing down on him like a wave. He didn't have to see the creature's face to know what it was. The voice, the words, the darkness. It all clicked. The creature had once been human. Number. It hadn't been human. Not anymore. But it had been something. It had been someone long ago. Something had happened to it. Something that twisted it, changed it, turning it into the abomination it had become. It was me, the voice whispered, its words slipping into Theo's mind like poison. I was the one who opened the door. The child had moved closer now, its footfalls silent on the dirt, but each step seemed to echo in Theo's skull like thunder. His body trembled, and he felt himself sinking lower into the ground, the earth pulling at him, dragging him toward the pit. The child raised its hand again, and Theo was compelled to follow. The voice in his mind, the thing in the pit, was so strong now, so overpowering, that Theo could feel himself losing touch with reality. His hands reached forward, as if on their own, his fingers digging into the wet, cold earth as he dragged himself toward the edge of the pit. He wanted to scream, to fight it, to break free, but he couldn't. I opened it. I had no choice. The voice twisted again, that cold, dead whisper turning into something darker, more desperate. I thought I could control it. But it took me. Took everything. Theo's heart pounded. The thing in the pit had been human once. It had been a man who had made a choice that led to the very horror that Theo was now facing. And the child, it wasn't just some innocent being. Number, the child had been a vessel, a link between this world and whatever was lurking in that pit. It had been waiting, watching, calling to Theodore. The child wasn't the one who had drawn him in. It was the thing in the pit. The voice inside his mind was growing louder, more insistent. The weight of it was unbearable. Theo could feel the pull now. He could feel himself slipping into the pit, into the darkness, into whatever awaited him at the bottom. His legs buckled beneath him, his body jerking forward, and for a moment, everything went still. Then came the whisper again. You are mine. Theo's hand shot out, grabbing for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. His body plummeted forward, his chest slamming into the dirt, and the world around him seemed to fold in on itself. The pit, its mouth was wide, hungry, and Theo could hear the sounds from within it, scraping, clawing, scraping. And then, with one final gut-wrenching scream, the earth seemed to close over him,